thank you all. This is awesome. I mean, 10 minutes ago, I was like, I think it's everybody. But it's nice. It's nice everyone came out, which is great. I'm just going to do this because we're not piped into the PA system here because that interferes with the Zoom. So that's why we're going to do that. So again, if you can't hear me, just please tell me to speak up. But I'll plan on doing this, and I'll try to be as close as possible to everyone. So before we really get started about why we're here and all the great topics we're going to talk about tonight, I did want to recognize the day today, right? This is an incredibly emotional day for our country. And I'm going to ask Reverend Rebecca Bryan from the First Religious Society, Unitarian and Universal, to come up and start us off with a remembrance and a prayer, if you would.
Yes, of course. So we're doing this
I guess
like
we'll do
this?
Right? I think we can do this.
Okay. Yeah. Can everyone hear me back there? So it's a little odd to yell a prayer, but I'll yell a prayer. More important than
We're not going to yell. We're not going to yell.
So just as the mayor was saying, and I'm grateful that we were taking the time in a public meeting like this to pause and to really remember what this day is about and what happened 23 years ago today. I don't know about you, but that's hard to believe. I didn't lose a family member or loved one. Is this, I can use this now?
It's for our broadcast.
Oh, so you can, is this?
Thank you.
Oh, it doesn't help them.
Yeah.
Hi, people online. I'm glad they're helped too. But I didn't lose a family member or a loved one myself. However, I know that although it feels hard for some of us to believe that that was 23 years ago, I know that for other people, every moment of every day, of every week, of every month, and of every year has been a lifetime. So I'm grateful we're going to take a minute to recognize this. So September 11th, or 9/11, as we know it, will never be the same for our country. It was that day that there were 4 jetliners that were crashed intentionally into the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and a field in southwestern Pennsylvania that ultimately killed 2,996 people. Since that time, there have been actually more people who have died as a result of the exposure to the toxins from that day. So in total, there is 6,000 or more people, not to mention the thousands and thousands of families and communities and colleagues and friends who have been affected by this. The pain of these losses has rippled through the cities and communities across our nation. As I said, families and friends who lost people that day have been mourning and living with this every day. So I'd like to take a moment now and pause and remember those people who have lost their lives. I want to invite us into a time where we can just go inside. If you're of a person, you may want to even bow your head in honor and memory of those who died. Here in Newburyport, we lost one of Newburyport's residents that day, Thomas Nicholas Pecorelli. Thank you for letting me honor him appropriately. Julie Collins Linder of Newburyport also lost her husband, Tommy Collins, who died in the tower that day. Julia lives here now. She lived at that time with her husband in New York. I would actually invite anyone who would want to speak aloud a name of someone you knew, you worked with, you loved, you were related to, who died on that day, so we might together in community pay honor and memory to these people. So as we remember these thousands of people and all the thousands of people connected to them, may they somehow find peace. Above all, may they know in this moment that there are people all across our country remembering them and that they are indeed not alone. Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
Actually, give that right here. All right, and for those of you that are still looking for ways to honor 9/11, the Exchange Club, it's their 15th year. They're doing their Field of Honor. If you've seen it up at Farmwood Map, that's taking place Sunday, 12 p.m. It honestly doesn't get a ton of people every year. It's an amazing ceremony and incredibly unique. So again, if you got nothing to do on Sunday, please stop by. They do a great job. Like I said, it's in its 15th year, and I'm happy and proud of it. I'll be speaking at that. Also, just a couple of housekeeping things. The Housing Choice Coalition has a table out there if you want to sign up to be a part of that and get information. I also have a flyer for the event that we're co-hosting with Amesbury next Wednesday at Amesbury High School at 6 p.m. It is it's on The Housing Trap, which is a book that was by Chuck Marone Jr. So we're happy it's part of Strong Towns. I don't know if anyone follows that. That's a kind of an online group. Strong Towns, but Amesbury reached out to do this together, and we were happy to collaborate with them. But that's happening next Wednesday at Amesbury High School at 6 p.m. Okay, so why are we here tonight? Right, we're here to talk about housing. I think we talk about this all the time at the city level, but once we started thinking about all the different topics and all the different things that would be happening this fall, we thought the best thing that we could do is come back here and talk about all those housing things coming up, just so we can bring some information to the public, right? We did a meeting similar to this. It was a little bit more interactive, but we did a meeting back in November where we kicked off our housing production plan process, the HPP plan that is now in City Council. Oh, sorry. Sorry. It seems ridiculous. So that HPP process, and so we thought, what a great opportunity to come back now that the plan is done and talk about it with everybody and share those, the product of everyone's efforts. So again, everyone's probably heard by now is that, we have a real housing crisis here in Massachusetts. Not just Massachusetts, but the country, but particularly Massachusetts. And I know the Healy-Driscoll administration have really taken this head on. But, I'm sure you've all heard the numbers, 200,000 units, right, that needs to be made up by 2030. Okay, so how are we going to get there? How are communities going to do their part? This is where MBTA communities came from, right? And we're in the process of getting what we've done to meet those guidelines by the state approved by the end of the year. People are leaving Massachusetts in record numbers because of housing, right? The biggest age group right now, 26 to 34, the largest demo leaving Massachusetts right now because they can't afford to live here, which is just crazy, right? I mean, I have kids in high school, I have a kid in middle school. I want them to be able to live in our state, in our hometown someday. So what can we do as a city, as a community to encourage more housing? And this is what tonight's all about, right? We're gonna have a lot of different speakers up here talking about a lot of different ways that we can, one, hopefully add some more strategic housing, but then also call attention to all the different housing options that are currently here. I think if you paid attention to the budget process this year, one of the things we heard from residents is, our assessments keep going up, right? Tax rates going down, but assessments are going up, right? Because we're a very desirable place to live, right? Our houses are worth more and more and more, right? But if you aren't a fixed income living at a home in Newburyport, and you're living in $1 million home, you might not be able to pay those taxes anymore, all right? Now you're making decisions about, am I buying food this week, or am I, saving up to pay my tax bill? So again, I think we have to look and see what levers we can pull at the city level, but then I think we also have to look at our housing stock and see what are the opportunities to get more options for people here in Newburyport. We've lost a lot of rentals over the years. How do we make up for that, right? And we've got some projects in the pipeline that we're going to talk about tonight that could add to that rental stock. Okay, so I feel like I'm just going on and on about this, but we have a lot of great speakers tonight. We're going to talk about MBTA communities. We're going to talk about Affordable Homes Act. We're going to have MVPC come up and talk about all the work they've been doing regionally around housing. We're going to have our Affordable Trust people out here, our Newburyport Housing Authority. And then Andy Port, of course, our wonderful Director of Planning, will be leading the way. But first, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful State Representative, Don Shan. Take the big mic.
And try to do what the mayor did and come a little closer. So as the mayor said, housing is a nationwide problem. This year, I see people in the back going, oh, okay, it's the best I can do. I'm going to yell about state figures. So the mic is for the Zoom call. It's not for us. So look, the state, we did something at the state level called the Affordable Homes Act. we put real muscle behind solving the housing crisis, which is keeping an entire generation from home ownership. We have so much to talk about tonight, but what is really exciting to me is that we're here in a room all together trying to solve this problem together. Like I said, it's a nationwide problem. We have state resources, but it's going to be places like Newburyport and rooms like this that come up with the solutions so that we can have first-time home buyers return to our community, so that seniors can find a way to stay in the community that they love, and where people who work in public service, in the fire department, in our restaurants, that they too can find a way to continue living in our community. So thank you all. I really hope we are excited about tonight. Zoning is not a topic where we often say, let's get excited about zoning, but that's what we're going to do tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Yeah, no, I didn't even mention the zoning piece. So, I mean, another whole part of all this is all the things the City Council will take up this fall, right? Oh, Senator Tar. How you doing? Hey, how you doing? Thank you for coming, Senator Tar. All right, so next, we're going to just get a little idea regionally what's happening. Andy, I don't know if you want to go up further on those slides. We can kind of get those going, even though, you know, I already talked through a couple of them.
So if just a quick recap of the mayor I think has covered most of this, but what we want to do tonight is, and I apologize because I do talk fast. Sorry, I will talk as loud as I can. Sorry. And I do talk fast, so I will try to slow myself down. What we want to cover tonight is what you're seeing on the screen, but background and context for the Commonwealth's housing crisis. Again, we're only glancing the surface of these issues. I would iterate or echo everything that the mayor and representative have said. We have members from our Housing Trust and Housing Authority here and our regional planning agency as well. So this is a huge issue. As a land use planner, by the way, I would note that the recent acts of the legislature are pretty significant. They're the most notable in my experience changes that the legislature has made to facilitate the new housing units and affordable housing units. So it's pretty significant from a land use planning perspective. We'll cover some of that tonight. The overview of the affordability gap we have here in Newburyport, I imagine you're here in part because you're aware of that and concerned about it. And that's, again, not just here in Newburyport. Reviewing the state requirements for local zoning that have to do with curation of housing and those options. And the overview of the housing production plan, which is, as the mayor mentioned, this is a busy fall for us in terms of zoning and development considerations in terms of housing. So we're going to give an overview of what that plan is recommending. As it's a draft that has been submitted for consideration by the City Council and will be reviewed by the Planning Board as well. And we'll touch on that briefly, but that plan is basically a guidance document for the future, and it does require approval from the City Council before it's forwarded to the state. We're going to review the key recommendations and strategies that are in that plan, and we're going to review some examples of affordable housing in Newburyport just to get an idea of what that looks like. I think the main point that I would express there is just, as you'll see, is that really affordable housing can really fit. Excuse me, yes?
You have to slow down, and you have to talk louder, because not everyone can hear that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I apologize because we don't, unfortunately, have integrated audio here at the Senior Center just yet. So I will talk as loud as I possibly can. We're going to review some of the, yes?
We can have this recorded for those who are on Zoom call. But for this audience who came here, maybe you can use a microphone so we can all hear. Because half this room cannot hear.
Right.
I do appreciate
I
that.
agree. That sounds like an excellent idea. We came here in person.
Understood.
People need to hear.
I appreciate that. I would let you know, and I don't know if we have a custodian who could help, but we have tried to get better equipment here. It does not, unfortunately, tie into what we have here. So, yeah, I'm not capable, unfortunately, of solving that problem directly myself.
I'm working on it.
Andy, do you want to speak in the middle and I can advance your slides or something?
Yeah, if you don't, maybe perhaps, yeah, sure.
You need your fake microphone, don't you, to make it
Yeah.
loud?
We have the mayor's
All right.
So we're going to review some examples of affordable housing and what that looks like in Newburyport. And my main point that I would express with that is you'll see in just some quick snapshot graphics of what that looks like, photographs. But that affordable housing can really fit into any neighborhood, and it's not only one type of affordable housing in terms of the structure or where it's placed. Reviewing the fall action items that we need the city council to take action on. I appreciate, by the way, recent sponsorship from some councilors, Councilor Shan, Councilor Donahue, as to the adoption of the affordable housing plan that is being reviewed by the city council in the coming weeks, and also that will be reviewed by the planning board. And also the Councilor Harmon and Councilor Khan for sponsoring the accessory dwelling units amendment, which is actually, as we'll touch on tonight, is actually required by the state. Some of those basic parameters are required to be updated in our zoning. So appreciate the sponsorship and mobilization of those updates. We have previously talked about, some of you may be familiar with MBTA communities, which is something we'll talk about. That's coming out of a previous legislation, but it is something we're acting on formally this fall to close that loop, to satisfy the state on that requirement as well. So we'll touch on that as well. And then we're going to hear any public comment or concerns or thoughts you may have about housing, so we can try as best as possible to take that into account, whether it's the final plan that's adopted or it's the actual implementation of that plan, which means regulatory changes, what we might do with public property, and so forth. Anything we can do to help with the affordable housing crisis. Some of that is also programs, by the way. There is a handout here with the information about the housing trust programs that are operated. So that's just some of the landscape we're covering. Gerard, I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit briefly to this, but sure. We have a patchwork. This is just a map of the Commonwealth, a patchwork of land use around the Commonwealth. And this has, I went through this in a longer presentation, I know in the spring, some of you may recall, but it's a longer planning explanation. You have to understand sort of the urban design background, but there's a long history of home rule in Massachusetts, right? And that local control over zoning has resulted in a patchwork of how things get done. And a lot of that becomes very cumbersome and confusing and can slow things down. So some of what the state has done is to step in. Oh, thank you, Mayor. So Gerard, perhaps you could speak to some of the state or regional perspective on that?
Yeah, good evening. Good evening, folks. I'm not sure if this is working either. Don't miss it. Again, good evening, folks. Okay. My name is Gerard Whitten. I'm with Merrimack Valley Planning Commission, and as Andy mentioned, we're one of the state's 13 regional planning agencies. We work very closely with Newburyport, with the planning staff, with the mayor's office, and 14 other communities in the region to help you advance different issues and projects that are important to communities. In particular, the area of housing has been a very complicated one for our region. I like the analogy that when we're driving in our car, the rear view mirror is really small. Why? Because we like to look forward. So I'm just going to spend a few moments on maybe why we're here, some of the reasons why we're here, because I think we're all collectively interested on what are the solutions moving forward. So as Andy alluded to, as Andy alluded to, each of the communities in Massachusetts has a home rule basis for how they govern, which means that we each independently can make decisions about how we zone and what we do. Andy, go to the next slide, please. One of the complications that each of our communities has faced historically is we tended to zone for each of us to have a home, to have land, and that hasn't always allowed for a diversity of different types of folks and different financial backgrounds to live in each of our communities. So long story short, where we've resulted here is a lot of sprawl. We've consumed a lot of our resources, and we haven't necessarily planned for different ways to have folks enter the housing market, people who are first-time home buyers, or folks like ourselves who may be looking eventually to downsize from the homes that we have. Maybe our children have left the area, and we want to move into something but still stay in this area. And that's really the complication that we're in here. So this isn't a problem that's unique to Newburyport. This is across our entire region, across our entire state. The previous administration dubbed it the housing crisis. And one important fact to keep in mind is in the 30-year period of essentially 1960 to 1990, we produced roughly double the housing units that we've produced in the most recent 30 years. So when you start to think about the implications of that and the cost of housing that results from a lack of supply, that's one of the contributing factors for why we're in this situation now. Just a couple other things there. Andy put up in item 3 there, home rule. We talked about that. Communities are making their own decisions. Certainly there's been some desire to not necessarily densify certain areas. I think you've got that up there as NIMBYism, not in my backyard. But the real issue here is what we talked about, that there are a lot of single-family homes in this region and far fewer options of what we're calling the missing middle. Areas where they're cottage style or a denser area that doesn't necessarily consume as much in the way of resources, but allows people to stay in this area, stay in a neighborhood. So that's really what this whole push from the administration has been about, ways to creatively add housing units and options in each of our communities. So from the Commonwealth's perspective, and Rep. Shand and Senator Tar can certainly speak to this more effectively, but the administration have come up with a couple different plans. One of them you heard about is the MBTA Communities Act. That's an act that requires each community in the Commonwealth to have multifamily zoning by right. Another more recently passed issue is the Affordable Homes Act, and you'll see there's a provision in there called accessory dwelling units, which are units that can be built on your property next to a single family residence. And then there are a lot of resources that the state has recognized are necessary to help support communities in their planning efforts. And much credit goes to Rep. Shand and Senator Tar for being cognizant of the things that our communities are going to need to plan for some of this expansion, to plan for the implementation of some of these regulations and some of the housing options that the state is really pushing. Andy, next slide, please. Just a little bit about me. I introduced with this, but we're a regional planning organization. We work with 15 communities in the northeastern part of the state, Newburyport being one of them, and that's part of our involvement here tonight.
And they are a really great regional planning agency, by the way. Gerard has heard me say this before, but they do a lot of resources for us, and this is just one of them. Sorry, has been helping us with the affordable housing plan itself, updating that.
Thank you.
So, what is the housing production plan? I think it's worth just briefly speaking to that. Strategic planning, this is the sort of planner's lens, right? Best practice. It's a best practice to think ahead and plan long-term rather than doing things sort of haphazardly and only for short-term questions or reasons. We adopt the plan for various state programs as well. One of them, there's been some recent discussion of a so-called safe harbor status under Massachusetts General Laws, MGL, Chapter 40B. But there are also other grant programs that will expect us to have a affordable housing plan in place. So it becomes important for us as well. Understandably, the state would like us, given the patchwork of communities across the Commonwealth, 351 cities and towns, it becomes important for us to have an active plan and to try to coordinate as best as possible. So they want to see us doing that as best we can locally. So what we have there is a need to submit that plan to the state as well. We update it every 5 years. The format and its substance follows state guidelines. So if you're, by the way, this plan is posted on the city's website. So we're only touching the surface of it tonight, but if you're interested in reading that. And then we have the prior plan and information on the Housing Trust page is posted as well. It examines the demographics, the median income, housing prices, of course, and does some comparison. We are typically looking between census breaks, so we're getting an idea on a 10-year cycle, roughly, of what's happening, and that's partly the measure that the state is looking at. And we identify the needs that the city has. Sometimes those are the same needs we've iterated before, and we're making progress in addressing them. Sometimes there are new things that we're identifying. And we, most importantly, I guess number 7, I would say, is recommending the housing strategies that we can do over the next 5 years. I did put a little footnote to the number 7 just to clarify, because the plan itself also, and this is a requirement from the state as well, has a table in it that is an estimation to the best of our ability, given what we know of the landscape of the community and the zoning districts that we have and the developments that could be, quote, in the pipeline coming forward, to basically estimate how we can achieve a unit count every year to make progress towards affordable housing. So the reason for that table in there is to try to be as specific as we can to show how we're going to make measurable progress towards that, not just statements that we want to do it, but estimation of how we could do it. Obviously, all of those individual projects or developments are still subject to the same local discussions of zoning, permitting, disposition of city property, and so forth. And these recommendations, essentially this plan, informs our decision-making over the next 5 years, and we use that as a guidance document. So as far as housing accomplishments, I don't know if perhaps one of our Housing Trust members wants to speak briefly to what has been done since the last housing plan.
Where are y'all get Alex? Oh, there you are. Okay.
Suzanne, you can stay there if you want. I'll put this right next to it.
Okay.
Just talk really.
I'm just gonna stand.
Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, everyone. I am Suzanne Cameron. I am the co-chair of Newburyport Affordable Housing Trust. Really great to be here tonight. I'm joined by my co-chair, Madeline Nash, who will be speaking as well. We also have some Housing Trust members in the audience. If you could just stand up, guys, and wave so everyone can see you. Awesome. Welcome. So we're a group of 7 housing professionals, and I say that in all sincerity, that we live and breathe and have made our careers in housing and community development. I think between us we have over 250 years of professional experience. So please, we consider ourselves an asset to the city, and we can provide a lot of really good information. Some of the things that we've accomplished over the last housing production plan period, which is 5 years, ending now-ish.
Yes.
Okay.
The cycles don't line up exactly day to day, right? Exact day, right? Yeah.
And I don't know, did we already talk about the housing production plan period is a 5-year period. We are embarking on the next 5 years. Okay. So in the last 5-year period, we've attained designation as a housing choice community. This allows us to obtain grants and other benefits from the state and other resources. We've conducted ongoing community education in partnership with other nonprofits like this, like the housing forum we had a few months back. The more you learn, the more you as residents and constituents and everybody else can make really good decisions and really understand what the problems are here and the benefits. I don't know if everyone picked this up, but you can pick it up later. The Affordable Housing Trust has implemented a bunch of really awesome programs. One is called HomePort. It's a down payment assistance program for folks earning up to 100% of the area median income, and we're going to get into all of that jargon in a minute. But what that means is that folks can get a $20,000 grant to buy their first home here in Newburyport. We also have a rental assistance program, which we implemented during COVID, and we decided to keep going with it because it's been incredibly useful and important. People get sick. People have issues where they can't get to work, and if you're earning an hourly wage and you can't get to work for a few days because you're ill, or you have the flu, or your child is ill, you fall behind on rent really, really easily. And so we've implemented this program so that folks can apply for a certain amount of money, there's a cap, to help ride those bumps and get back on track. We have helped almost 60 families stay in their housing that they're in their rental housing, because of this program. This is so incredibly important, because without good, safe housing, kids miss school, people miss more work, people get sick. It's stressful not to have housing for you and your family. So I can't stress that enough, how important that program is. We also have a program for our nonprofit partners who maintain affordable housing throughout the city. And so when a tenant moves on, and if anybody here is a landlord, you know, no matter how awesome your tenant is, you're going to have some wear and tear in the unit. A refrigerator blows, or a dishwasher breaks, or the carpet is ripped or something. We have grants for our nonprofit partners to get that unit back up and operating in a really nice new way. And then we also have a home modification loan program that is with our partners at Community Teamwork. They're based in Lowell. So what else?
That's great.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to go on and on. I'm preaching a little bit.
What's the home modification? What?
So this is for folks who have a disability or are older, and they need to make put in a ramp, or open a doorway and make home modifications so that they can stay in their house.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you. up here. So the Housing Production Plan Stakeholder Group, obviously we want as much input into this plan as possible, and the plan is not finished as of yet. It is still being, and it's just starting the process to be reviewed by the City Council. It will also be reviewed by the Planning Board in the coming weeks as well. So to be clear, this is a draft plan, but it's intended to be comprehensive and to fulfill the state requirements and to cover what it needs to cover to address the affordable housing needs in Newburyport. So a couple of the folks that are sort of key representatives, if you will, as you might expect: Office of Planning and Development, myself, the Chief of Staff, Andrew Levine, Caitlin Sullivan, who's our staff planner, Suzanne Cameron, Madeline Nash, both from the Housing Trust. We have the Pettingill House representative, Tracy Watson from the Newburyport Housing Authority, City Council representatives, thank you Ed and Heather, and we have obviously MVPC. We have some staff at MVPC that's been great assistance to us in developing this plan, and they're also, because they're working with other communities, they are also familiar with what's happening there. So the process for developing the plan, this is just to give you an idea, for those of you who probably aren't familiar with how that works, we have, the great assistance from MVPC in satisfying some of the data preparation and the plan requirements. The reviewing the draft plan itself, the Office of Planning and Development, the Trust reviewed that. We revised that. That's where we see the draft date is dated June. We got return back edits, and so of course we're looking at that revised version now. We have a review and approval that has to happen by the City Council and the Planning Board before we can ship that off to the state. It will be approved by the state, presumably, and they'll let us know if there's any questions or concerns they have. And it has a housing production plan that the implementation of it is not that we would do exactly as specifically called for in the plan. The plan is a guidance document. We know that there might be variations in how things actually get implemented, but there's a 5-year cycle for implementation, and that cycle repeats essentially. One of the ways that the plan in terms of its implementation, even if we're not doing the exact changes or recommendations that are in there for, say, specific development projects or specific number of units at a given location, is that we can have the plan essentially certified. First, the plan is approved. That's the plan essentially by the state saying, yes, you have an active plan, a reasonable plan for producing more housing and more affordable housing in the next 5 years. The certification of the plan, that's why if you can notice a slight difference in color, approval and certified. Certified means that we've made progress in implementing that plan, not necessarily exactly the specific projects or developments that are recommended or noted in there as possibilities, but we've made a unit count. So here, you might have heard before, the 10% threshold is particularly important. If you're at 10%, you can be in the so-called safe harbor status. That has to do with another state statute we'll get to in a moment. But in certifying the plan, either having 10% of our year-round housing stock, which is based on the denominator of that ratio, is the census count. So 2020 census count, that's what we're looking at as our denominator. And on the top of that is the number of affordable housing units we have. So I think we have 784 units that are considered affordable on the subsidized housing inventory. Our subsidized housing inventory right now is 9.45%, so we're very close to that 10%. We were actually just above, I think, at 10.1 just last year, but the state began using the new census numbers. So in catching up and seeing a larger denominator, the bottom portion of that fraction, we see here that we've gone down a little bit. But the recent changes that have allowed us to get to the 10% are actually part of our smart growth district around the train station, which we'll touch on in a moment. So the safe harbor status is particularly important. I will say, just as a land use planner, it's important because, there's a well-meaning statute here in trying to create affordable housing. It does unfortunately present sort of a loophole, if you will, for developers to possibly dismiss certain local zoning considerations and requirements in the effort to have a denser development. So in essence, the developer can come in and say, you're not at 10%, I'd like to propose a project, I'd like to submit it to the ZBA, the Zoning Board of Appeals, have it approved, and putting aside all the process involved there, it can basically override local zoning. And I will definitely say in the case of Newburyport, we have a lot of characteristic neighborhoods. Community character is very important to us. So it is important in my view that we maintain maintain control of our local zoning. So either being at 10% or making progress each year. In this case, the 42 units that I put in brackets is the number that we would need to create each year, or be permanent each year. That is what allows us to get the plan certified by the state. So that is important, not just for the creation of affordable housing, which is obviously the primary reason we're here, but also because it helps us to maintain our local control over zoning. We continue the plan implementation, and again, that cycle begins again in about 4 years, because it takes about 6 to 12 months to prepare the plan, with drafting it and with getting input from various parties along the way, as we're seeing this as part of it, before it can ever be sent to the state for review there. Here, and I don't know if perhaps Suzanne, if you want to speak to us a little bit, we thought it would be good, I think, to speak to some of the numbers and the thresholds, just to kind of put that in a framework.
Yes, here comes that
Oh,
fun
sorry,
education.
do you mind just for them to stand here?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, because they're yeah, thank you. Apologies.
So let's talk about income and what it means. What's the definition of affordable? So we look at, the affordable housing developers, people who rent out apartments, people who buy homes, look at what's called an area median income, which is, yes?
Is that based off of pre or post-tax?
That is pre. So this is gross income, okay? Where Newburyport gets its area median income is based on a much larger, what's called a metropolitan statistical area, or an MSA. So we're looped in with Boston and its suburbs, where incomes are super, super high. And so the standards for affordability in Newburyport are based upon incomes all the way down to Boston and all through Essex County and around, okay? So keep that in mind. So 80% of area median income is the top income threshold, that defines affordable housing. And any of my friends just yell at me if I'm getting this wrong. So if you earn, and this is from, I'm gonna bring you up to date on 2024 figures in a minute. So for a one-person household, the top income that would be considered for affordable housing is $82,950 for one person. Okay, so when we look at area median income, the definition of affordable rent is 30% of that number, okay? So in this case, the monthly income, if you take $89,950 and divide it by 12, $69,12, that's your monthly income, 30%, or about a third of that, is $2,073 a month for rent, okay? Does that sound affordable? No, okay.
Hey, you'll note, by the way, this is why affordable is in parentheses, is in quotation marks, right?
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to okay. So this is all data that is coming out of the housing production plan. So I'm going to skip ahead to the next housing production plan, because right now in 2024, the area median income for a one-person household is $91,200. So if I'm working downtown, or at the hospital, or I'm a teacher, or whatever, I can't afford the rent. I'm not going to be able to afford the rent, because my income may or may not be below that $82,000 threshold. Okay. Does that make any questions so far? I know this is all really technical, and I don't want to insult anybody by not asking you if you have questions. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, I wish we could have these two slides side by side. Okay, so this is the difference between a market rate rent, and these are examples from 1 Boston Way and 3 Boston Way, compared to an affordable rent. And I'm going to stick with that one-person household and that studio apartment on the top. So the market rent is $21.85, and the affordable, based on that calculation, is $18.77. The market rate for 3 Boston is $23.29 compared to $2,073 in 3 Boston Way. So what's going to happen this year? when the area median income for 80% of area median income shoots to 91,200. What happens? The rent goes up. And they can do that because that's the formula. And I do want to say that when developers are putting together their pro forma, and they say, okay, X number of units for 80%, X number of units for 60%, X number of units for 30%, those rents are going to be tied exactly to the top of those income limits, right? So if I'm earning 60% area median income, I can qualify for a rent or qualify for an apartment in a building that's for 80% below, but I can't afford it because it's priced to the 80%. Okay, so I just don't want that to get lost on you because it's a really important fact. Okay. Sorry, I get very excited.
Just so everyone knows, too, real quick, all these slides will be available after this. I know there's a lot on there, it's tough to see, but everything will be available online. You can check these out.
Yeah, just to clarify, we will post this to the event on the calendar, so if you're looking for it, you'll see it there.
Okay, so now let's talk about home ownership. Okay, so the median housing price in Newburyport, this is again from last year, was $775,000. What is it this year? Over $1.1 million. Yes, I pulled that number before I came, okay? So, it's true. So, without getting into what an affordability gap is, basically it's what we're all earning versus the median price of a house here in Newburyport. And guess what? There's an affordability gap of over $300,000. That is ridiculous. We don't have the housing here for the people who live here. We have housing here for the people who want to cash out of their Boston houses and move up here or from wherever, but not for us here. Okay, so it makes it virtually impossible for us to downsize or for our kids to buy a house. It's not happening right now. Okay, and then finally, and I'm going to get off my soapbox now, but we are losing. So when we say little a affordable housing, that is not what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, right? So say I have a 2-family house and I'm renting my apartment out for $1,500 or $2,000 a month. That is affordable according to the definition, but it's not documented anywhere. I'm just doing that because that's what I'm paying. That's what I'm charging for rent. So we call that little a affordable housing. We're losing, we've lost in the last 10, 15 years, it's way over this, 300 of those rental units. Because a lot of the buildings that used to have these smaller apartments are being converted into luxury condos that we can no longer afford. Okay, so that's another issue. And with all that really good news, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. Any questions on any of that?
We're going to do a Q&A at the end. Questions about it.
Folks, one of the things that I've learned through this process is there's always a detail in the data that really hits. It hits one of us, it connects with one of us. And the important part of this graphic is it's representing a little under the 24-year period, which would be back to 2000, it's 20 years. And the graphic that hit me and may resonate with some of you folks is that those of us who bought our homes 20 years ago or more are paying less in our mortgages than the folks who are trying to rent now. Quick show of hands, anybody know that the case for themselves or other folks? Right. So that's one of the real complications here that's taking place. You see household income's only grown by 89%, home values increased by 140%. So that's increasing and exacerbating that problem. And it's just really important to keep that in mind because that's the current situation versus the point in time when many of us bought our homes years ago. So think about the people we're trying to attract into this community now who maybe start homes. Can they afford at this level? Probably not. Thanks.
Thank you.
So
So some of the key data findings, again, we're just touching on this. The plan elaborates on it a little further, but I'm just going to hit the highlights here that are underscored. Newburyport's population is aging and declining. This is generic, right? So we don't, things might be adjusted in the future, but Newburyport's renting households have a high rate of cost burden. We obviously touched on that a little bit. Newburyport's housing stock may not actually fit the current needs. We don't have a whole lot that can fulfill that affordable housing need based on the patterns that we're seeing right now and the number of units that are available, especially with the loss of rentals of that order of magnitude. Purchasing a home in Newburyport, as we said, is out of reach for most residents. And Newburyport continues to see a decrease in those rental units. So this is just a trend. It's not the final number. We've lost 300, then we stopped. We have continued to see some of that. In some cases, in the case of 103 Boston Way, for instance, we have seen the creation of some rental units. Again, putting aside for a moment the debate as to whether or not the numbers, whatever percentages you use, are considered affordable. And then the affordable housing stock is about 9.4% right now, again. So, we think about the housing need, and I completely agree with what Suzanne was saying about the needs here. Realistically, what we're talking about is, we sometimes frame it as, let's get to 10%. Reality is, shouldn't we be going well beyond 10%, over the number of people and the percentage of residents that can find an affordable unit? Presumably we want to get much higher than just 10%. So the most progress, by the way, has happened in recent years, has happened as a result of the 40R Smart Growth District. And you'll see here, although you may not be able to read the font, in 2017, we had 7.5% of the city's housing stock was that big A affordable, actually listed as affordable, following certain parameters and so forth, not the little a where it's just happening, sort of on the street, but nobody's tracking it. But these are the ones that are formally recognized by the state through that process. We had 7.5% when the 40R district was being developed and permitting's happening and those units are being added. We increased to 9.4. We actually got above 10%, but then the new census numbers are being used, so we're back at 9.4. So we're very close to that 10%, so to speak. Affordable housing being right-sized, we have to right-size it for the older adults as well. We have, sometimes they're not the right sizes. Affordable home ownership and low and middle-income families, that's the same need. Affordable rental options for current and future residents. Again, there are not enough rental options in Newburyport. An increase in the housing types of all types. So as Gerard mentioned earlier, we have a lot of, this is particularly true across the Commonwealth, perhaps more so than Newburyport, but the single-family large lot sprawl, that you might have heard that term sprawl, that tends to use a lot of land, but it also doesn't necessarily create a variety of housing options. And that's one reason why we see, in the case of the MBTA communities, the state calling for more multifamily housing, where the units are closer together, might be a little bit more affordable because they're smaller in scale, don't require as much maintenance or purchase price and so forth. And also the accessory dwelling units, right? Another type of housing that is not an entire single-family home that has to be purchased at, say, $1 million. So some of the housing production strategies that we have. Strategy one is to activate and to utilize the public and privately owned property to support the community needs. We've obviously had some discussion in recent time, and I apologize, I'm going to pass this to our housing trust group. To the Brown School, obviously we've talked about recently, so that's a public property, the most sizable one or notable one we have that could facilitate that.
Hi, I'm Madeline Nash, co-chair of the Affordable Housing Trust. Mary Ann said, I'm drinking?
No.
Okay.
Bring it closer to your mouth.
Anyways, nice to see you all here, and I'm just pitching in to share the story. Did you just say strategy one?
I did, yes.
Okay, cool. And I just want to emphasize that the city's been doing a lot of work on that, and you'll be hearing more about it tonight, especially looking at municipally owned property.
We hear you.
Okay, gosh, all right.
Super close, man.
Yeah, okay. Strategy 2, investigate and expand zoning regulations to allow for housing types that accommodate the needs of residents. You'll be hearing more about that too. Strategy 3, continue to encourage development and preservation of both renter and owner-occupied housing that is affordable to both low and moderate income households, specifically 30 to 80% area median income. Suzanne was talking about the area median income levels,
And one of the things we want to point out is it's not just the upper tier at 80%, but also the 30% AMI and the 60% AMI. That's where you'll find most renter households in Newburyport currently have incomes that are around 50% area median income. Is there another slide?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Great, thanks. Strategy 4, continue and expand Newburyport Affordable Housing Trust programs that provide direct and indirect housing financial support for Newburyport residents through a variety of offerings. Those are the different programs that Suzanne mentioned to you. And we get some of our funding through the Community Preservation Act funds, so that's an important source for us to be able to continue to offer these important programs. Strategy 5, seek to maintain designation as housing choice community to continue preferential access to state development-related grants. And strategy 6, continue to refine and prioritize community education and engagement to foster shared learning and understanding of the existing housing landscape, which is part of what we're doing here tonight. And it's so important to help people understand this complicated and complex landscape. Many of you may have not thought about area median income and how does it relate to me and my family, but it's important that we understand these things because it will relate to our zoning and some of the other things that we'll be talking about tonight in terms of development opportunities in the city.
Thank you very much. So as she mentioned, the regulatory environment, I'm just touching briefly on this, but a couple of state statutes or regulations that touch on this. So Massachusetts general laws, that's the MGL. 40A is the Zoning Act. It comes from general police powers, so the general ability of a municipality under home rule to do what's in the public interest and regulate that. But it is limited by certain provisions, and that's how that Zoning Act is essentially structured. The Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 40B, which is, and there's a subsection of that, that's dealing with comprehensive permits, and that's the, I mentioned earlier, sort of a streamlined permit process where a developer could essentially override your local zoning if they want a denser development. When the community is not at 10% or hasn't made progress towards that affordable housing, there's a potential for a developer to come in and say, I'd like to do something more than that and I'd like to push aside your zoning in order to facilitate this. There's a presumption in those projects. There's a commitment of 25% of those units have to be affordable, but that's the sort of exchange that's happening in that 40B process. In lieu of whatever local zoning or permitting process might be there, in essence, what's happening is there's a singular filing given to the Zoning Board of Appeals. That Board of Appeals would review this. The last time I think Newburyport had this was the Woodman Way development. That permit process would be a consolidated review for any local, zoning or permitting needed. And the question there is basically, are they doing the 25% of the affordable units, but the other things like height, density, massing, things like that may not be necessarily appropriate with the given neighborhood. So that is a consideration. But it has been one mechanism at the state, through the state, where we have tried, around the Commonwealth to try to create affordable housing by having a threshold of 25% at least of the units being affordable, as opposed to say 0, because sometimes developers benefit from just having them all be market rate. So Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 40R, that's the smart growth districts, and that's where we adopted our own smart growth district around the train station. That's essentially multifamily developments that are allowed as of right, and they're near transit. So that's the general essence of what the smart growth districts are and what ours is. The two that I've highlighted down the bottom there, and I did want to put, just because I put it down the bottom there, these are both state recognition and timely action, and I think pretty significant from a land use perspective, a recognition that housing is a crisis and a need in the Commonwealth. And we can't have, unfortunately, if we're going to have organization and process in that, 351 cities and towns all doing their own thing becomes very cumbersome. There's a lot of really unique provisions that can kind of slow things down. So two things that there's an attempt to streamline that come from the Economic Development Bill previously, which is the MBTA Communities piece. I'll touch on that in a moment. That is essentially an advancement beyond our smart growth district to require more communities to to participate in that in a similar way. We had already done that, so we're a step ahead with that. But that is that requirement around the train station, essentially. The Affordable Homes Act, which Representative Shan spoke to earlier, the accessory dwelling units is the key thing that we're highlighting in there. That is also a state requirement that, in this case, is not limited to just the MBTA communities area around Boston, but actually requires around the Commonwealth accessory dwelling units to be allowed as of right, subject to certain parameters. So just to be clear, while there is a sort of sweeping allowance that is being mandated across the Commonwealth, it is still subject to certain parameters that are relevant and necessary for a local community to consider. So these are both meant to, I think, contribute both to better land use patterns, particularly with the case of MBTA communities where you're consolidating that housing near transit, doesn't require as many car trips, might be more affordable, and you're also streamlining the permitting for the affordable housing options and choices. So this is just a quick snapshot of the MBTA communities area. So you can see a pretty wide area is affected by this. This doesn't color code the community types. So we are a commuter rail community. We're not core in the denser part near Boston. We're further out, so our parameters are a little bit different. But in essence, the policy objectives are to increase the housing production. MBTA communities is not directly focused on the affordable housing. It is more focused on the production of units. I think the presumption there is that market competition and the availability of housing helps with housing prices, right? That's at least, a step in that right direction. There can be an affordable housing component, but there are certain parameters or limits on that. It's to have that increase in housing production, to have it at the right locations, which is near transit, have it be walkable, and then also, obviously, to the denser neighborhoods will support the MBTA itself. So this is just briefly the bullet list of essentially what the requirements are for Newburyport to satisfy MBTA communities. So it's multifamily use as of right, which is the case we already have in our smart growth district around the train station, and I'll show a map of that in a second. The minimum district size is 35 acres, and again, some of these are specific to communities based on their size and other sort of algorithms and parameters, so I'm not going down the rabbit hole on that, but I'm just giving you an idea of what the parameters are as applied to Newburyport. Some of these parameters, like the 15 units an acre minimum for gross density of these developments that are allowed under zoning, that some of that is universal across the Commonwealth, but some of the parameters, like the 35 acres, are developed by the state based on the size and other parameters of your community. So the main thing that we have been focused on here, as we've evaluated going back to the spring with the city council, as we were discussing what to do to satisfy MBTA communities, was the unit capacity. So the minimum unit capacity that Newburyport has to satisfy is this 1,292 units, and that is the total projected units according to a certain build-out calculation that basically we would be able to produce if someone were to fully build out, which doesn't happen right away, and certainly it doesn't necessarily happen entirely anyway. But over time, if the full district was built out at that capacity, following those parameters, you get 1,292 units total. For comparison, the original 40R district, when it was developed, which, to be clear, was under some slightly different parameters from the state, so the calculations are not quite the same equivalent, but that was originally estimated to be about 540 units. We actually get more credit for that district under MBTA communities because of the way that the calculations are done for that density and the build out. But in essence, we are working off of that base essentially. The minimum percent of the district that has to be around the train station is 20%. In our case, as you'll see in a moment, all of the proposed expansion of our smart growth district to satisfy MBTA communities, which is to essentially expand the district. Some communities have to create an entirely new district. We already have one, and we're able to expand that, so a little bit more straightforward. But ours is all within the half-mile radius of transit, so really exactly what the state is looking for here. There can be no age restrictions, and they have to be suitable for families. So obviously we, at least land use planners are often, we sometimes see around the Commonwealth, there's a preference for, say, senior housing, doesn't have any school-age children, doesn't bring the cost of school-age children into question for municipalities. That is something that has happened over the years and decades, and the Commonwealth is essentially saying we can't have that limitation here because that's problematic. So, so no limits on the size of the units or the caps on the number of bedrooms or occupancy. And then the affordable housing, the one sort of note about that is that The MBTA community statute has a parameter that basically says you can start with a baseline of 10% of the units that a developer makes have to be affordable. You can call for the 10% of those units to be affordable, but you can only go up to 20% under this program. So while you've heard us mention before, you might have heard me mention before with the 40B, it's 25%, and with our 40R district, it's 25%. Here, under MBTA communities, the state was setting a parameter between 10% and 20% maximum. And then I said here, with a justified EFA. The EFA is an economic feasibility analysis. So there are some communities, we're not necessarily one of them that have to do it because of the building off our 40R district. But communities have to basically prove to the state that a developer can make it economically viable. I will just say for the record, I'm convinced developers can make it work. But we have to demonstrate that a developer can make it economically viable to produce up to that 20% of units. So I won't speak to where other communities are ending up in that. I know Gerard and Ian and the folks who've been working at it, MVPC, and the other regional planning agencies and communities can speak to that a little bit, but they may not be able to get to the same percentage. We opted to essentially expand our 40R district, partly because we can hold developers responsible for doing 25% of the units affordable and would not be constrained by that limitation. So our options, just as a reminder for some folks, but for some of you just new, just briefly, our options to satisfy the MBTA communities requirement really had three different areas that we could put it in. So downtown Newburyport, the only area realistically I think that might have come up there is Waterfront West. There's been a whole series of discussions with Waterfront West, and that's a more complicated one, I think. So that wasn't really being contemplated here so much, although it would have been eligible, let's say, from the state's perspective. The two other areas that we had to work with really were more of a focus were Story Ave and Low Street. That's this whole Port Plaza and around that area, which I'll show in a moment. And also the Smart Growth District itself, in this case, basically building off of the existing Smart Growth District that we had adopted years ago. So this is the 40R Smart Growth District. You're seeing the traffic circle there. You're seeing the Route 1 corridor going up. And in essence, what you're seeing is that irregular shaped district is an overlay, and it allows superseding on top of the industrial district that's on the western side, and some of the commercial sort of areas around the traffic circle, allows multifamily to be developed as of right with a design review, site plan and architectural design review process with some standards that are in the ordinance. And so that's where we have actually seen the developments of 1 and 3 Boston Way. Just to show my hand here for a second. 1 Boston Way is actually, this is a previous map, but this parking lot was converted to 1 Boston Way, the building we'll see in a second, and 3 Boston Way was developed here where the old ambulance facility was. So these are 2 redevelopments in the 40R district that happened per that zoning. The third one that has been permitted is up here by Haley's, the Haley site. That has not been constructed yet, but we expect that to start next year. There is tapering off of a smaller sub-district over here, I should note, by State Street. So there's a smaller scale allowance of height and massing here, recognizing that we want to transition to compatibility of neighborhoods there. This is just an example of the 1 Boston Way project. The 3 Boston Way is comparable in terms of architecture. 166 Route 1 is a little bit different, but 1 and 3 Boston Way are both occupied. These are both 25% of the units are affordable, and they are all rentals. I guess 2 footnotes about that. One is rentals are really important to the city, so it's really important and beneficial that those are rentals and that we also have similar type projects with rentals in the future. It's also beneficial because with the 25% of the units being affordable, again, the maximum we typically see required and able to be required of developers, with the 25% being affordable and all of the units in the building being rentals, the city actually, pursuant to some state guidelines, gets credit for all of the units that are in the building on the subsidized housing inventory, the state's sort of official listing of what we have as local affordable housing. Even though they're not themselves deed restricted as those affordable prices, we get credit for those because the state was recognizing the need for rental housing, right? So there was a sort of a beneficial preference there for when we're having rental units. So from a mechanical sort of numerical perspective, we've benefited in several ways from the 40R district, the high percentage, relatively speaking, of the affordable units that are being created in there, and also the rental units, and then beyond that, the benefits to the subsidized housing inventory, which backs into making sure we can control our local zoning. So Newburyport's compliance with MBTA communities is in effect to, and we'll have a Q&A towards the end, just FYI. Towards the 40R district, the way that I've tried to describe this before is the 40R district that we adopted years ago, and that some other communities did as well, is more like an option. It's more like the carrot. So the communities were given an option, you get a financial benefit, streamlined. We actually got a $2 million, for example, of other financial benefits. We got $2 million towards a new sewer lift station that was constructed down to help the business park and the neighborhood. And so that was a financial benefit. We've also received cash payments from the Commonwealth because of the 40R district. So that was the carrot approach. MBTA communities, the way I view it, is really more of a modern, it's sort of the stick approach, saying every community or a number of communities have to do this because it's needed more widespread, right? So that's maybe, just to kind of use terminology we might have heard before, that's the way I would look at it, is it's really a sort of recreation, if you will, of the smart growth district framework, slightly different parameters, but encouraging the same thing. Multifamily housing, as of right, streamlined process, not in question for developers as to can they ever get it approved, but clear that that use is allowed, subject to some design standards and review. And so we opted into that, and MBTA Communities is essentially extending that here, wanting that same similar housing around transit. It's previously been approved by the state. Again, I mentioned before, we get to grandfather or keep our 25% affordable housing requirement rather than being, compelled to make it lower potentially. And then multifamily use is as of right with that design review. We have decided to expand the district along Parker Street, and I'll show that in a second on a map. And it's here, the benefit in doing that, I think, is that we're connecting the transit and the housing with the adjacent business park. And we have a plan to extend the bike path that is there and now successfully crossing Route 1 to be able to extend that further. So there's a real connection between a place of employment, a center of employment, and residences and transit. So this is just a map of the smart growth district. You're seeing that sort of in red or pinkish. Is the smart growth district the core of it? The bluish area that you're seeing off to the right is the sub-district, where in the reddish district, it's 40 units an acre, and this is the equivalent of what you're seeing at 1 and 3 Boston Way. Those projects are 40 units an acre. In the blue area, that's a smaller sub-district. That's 30 units an acre and 3 stories, as opposed to 4 stories elsewhere in the district. So tapering down as we go up High Street or up, State Street, obviously towards the neighborhoods that already exist. Here we are proposing 2 changes to expand this district and thereby satisfy the primary component we've had to focus on, which is the total unit capacity. So our existing smart grid district does provide a substantial number of units, but it doesn't quite get us there. And so the way that we have done that, and we are proposing to do that, and we are waiting for the state to circle back and confirm that this will, quote, comply with a so-called pre-approval review, but the council will be expected to vote on this formally in the fall. We have had a fair amount of discussion about it, so for us, it should be more or less a formality that we go through the adoption process. Not quite as complicated as some other communities have had a fair amount of debate about where to put it and how to do it. But here we've decided to do 2 things. The green area that you're seeing on the right is, technically speaking, is not really new development that would happen because of this zoning. It's actually sort of taking credit for the Hines Way development that was done recently, where effectively that area can be essentially credited. We can get some credit for that area the way that the statute works. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of explaining it all, but we can get some credit for that area to meet the unit capacity. The primary component really is the Parker Street extension that you see, the bluish on the right, on the left, I should say, and that is the expansion of the district. So it's basically expanding that primary pink or red area to the Parker Street section, and having a few slight differences in terms of the front setbacks or whatnot to the street, just to make sure we can carry that bike path, for instance, but for the most part comparable in that way. And that would essentially meet the unit capacity, which was the primary piece we had to look at that we weren't able to quite satisfy with our smart growth district. The Affordable Homes Act is the newer piece of legislation, and it has the accessory dwelling units in it. So ADUs, the accessory dwelling units, have to be allowed as of right within single-family zoning districts. So anywhere a zoning district allows single-family as of right, this is the ADU, is essentially allowed as of right as well. It needs to be accessory to that primary residential use. It's not allowed on its own. It's accessory. And it cannot be used as a short-term rental unit. In the draft, and I appreciate Councilors Harmon and Khan sponsoring an order for consideration ordinance that we will discuss in committee and refine if need be to facilitate that. And they cannot be used as short-term rental units. Obviously, that it should go without saying that we don't want to create units and have them used as tourist, rotations. They're really actually meant for local residents, as Suzanne was mentioning earlier. We need housing for local residents. And so this is not to be used for that purpose.
Can you talk about tax rates if you have ADUs?
I'm sorry, if you don't mind, we're going to hold the questions until the end, and then we'll take them then, just so that we can, in fairness to all, we'll take it.
That's a good question. Let's just answer that. No, let's keep going.
Yeah, apologies. We'll circle back. Thank you. So the smaller of these two numbers, essentially these two parameters, is what the size of it can be. Again, the state's trying to make sure that these are not overly, in proportion to the unit that's already there, and they're relatively small in size, so they can be essentially affordable and not oversized. So smaller than 900 square feet, or half of the gross floor area of the principal dwelling that's already there on that lot. So that's kind of the baseline there. Communities, by the way, I'm not going to a whole lot of explanation, but communities can go beyond and allow more, but there are certain things the state has mandated you must allow or have to follow certain parameters. So some of these things are parameters. Other things a local community can expand on or modify from there, or give further relief and allowance. Setback and massing and dimensional requirements still apply. So just to be clear, this is because I'm sure that around the Commonwealth, not just in Newburyport, as we discuss the allowance of accessory units, there's always that, how does that fit into a neighborhood? What would that look like? Is it attached to an existing structure? Is it a new structure? All of those dimensional requirements that are there still apply to those structures. It's the use that it cannot be sort of brought into question, if you will, that the state's addressing here. So if there's concern about massing and scale and so forth and things like that, those are really already addressed by the zoning, and those aren't necessarily undone by this. There are a few things that are sort of touched, but for the most part, it's the setbacks and constraints and things like that are already addressed by the local zoning and would be essentially carried through. There's a maximum that you can require of 1 parking space for that accessory dwelling unit. However, the state has indicated that within a half-mile radius of the transit, we cannot require that parking space, because the presumption is that you can sort of walk to the transit, right? Sort of encouraging that land use pattern and usage. You couldn't mandate it within that radius. For our purposes, just to be clear, that would be the MBTA train station, and we would consider the parking garage or MBA RTA parking transit facility that we have downtown, the new parking garage, as another one. This is the Story Avenue area. So sorry, just to, this is the, I should clarify, Councilor Shand, the date of the, and I forget off the top of my head, and Rick, you might be able to recall the date of the hearing on accessory dwelling units that we.
It's probably going to be October the 2nd.
October the 2nd. Take you very much.
October with the planning board.
Thank you. We were just conferring on that today, so thank you. That will be to look at this new zoning amendment. So MBTA Community is the formal package, even though we've already discussed the real substance of it, and I think agreed upon how we want to address that. The new amendment for ADUs is being mobilized to committee, and we'll review that as well. There'll be a joint public hearing with the planning board in the typical format to get public input, to provide feedback from the planning board to the city council, and make any edits or tweaks to that ordinance before it's adopted. That has to be done prior to February of next year, by the way. Certainly better for us to do it this fall than to wait till the last minute, but we don't want to be out of date and out of compliance with the state. This is the Story Avenue and Low Street area. I'm not going into great detail, but what we had started this spring, we had contemplated, first we wanted to determine whether or not we were going to satisfy MBTA communities only at the train station, or whether we were also going to utilize this area, because that had been brought into question as well, whether or not it would benefit us to use this area or some of this area up where Port Plaza is, the park and ride lot and so forth, whether or not we would, Market Basket, whether we would utilize that area to allow it to be rezoned and therefore take credit for it under MBTA communities. We decided not to do that, to utilize our 40R district and expand that. So we decided we would revisit this in the fall. We'd pick up again a larger rezoning study of the Story Avenue, Low Street area. So just a note here that this is sort of an approximate boundary. I think that the general assumption is we want to have a similar sort of multifamily allowance, a little bit more streamlined process, still with design review, some of the 40R really, but maintaining, I think one thing that's come up here a little bit is the desire to maintain and to keep that commercial, to keep that mixed use, so we don't lose that while we're trying to make more residences and make it more vibrant as a real village center, not just residences in isolation, or not just commercial space in isolation, but really a walkable neighborhood. Really, effectively, Newburyport's historic downtown in a way, right? We have that historically because people had to build that way. in America, we had sprawl kind of take over for a couple of decades, but we're lucky here that we have that example, and I think we can recreate another village center, if you will, or neighborhood there. It'll never replace the downtown, but it can be a proper land use form rather than the sort of traditional commercial strip mall. And I would note, by the way, the park and ride lot is that's on the left there is owned by the Commonwealth, but that is a possibility, and we have been in some conversations with the Commonwealth about whether or not there is some possibility there to not only have that transit component, but also potentially have housing there, and that's something that would be up to the state, really. More recently, there's been discussion specifically of a subset of that area because of the vacancy at the Kmart site that's been there for a couple of years. We have had recent discussions, and there is a zoning change that we'll be looking at next Wednesday in this building here at 7 o'clock, joint public hearing of the Planning Board and City Council to look at a rezoning, a possible rezoning of the Kmart site. This potential rezoning is based on the, referred to as acronym as the PPOD, would be built on the 40-yard district framework. So comparable in that permitting process, generically speaking. We'll talk more about that next week. But that change that has been proposed or considered on the council for discussion would focus specifically on that sort of rectangular area that we're looking at. It could possibly modify, but that's basically the area that's been brought into question from the landowner and the development team that's interested in doing it, and has sort of some tie-in here as to the zoning. We have also had discussion recently as to whether or not that would be a so-called friendly 40B process. So there's two different ways that things can be permitted, essentially. One is the traditional zoning process. We rezone this. Someone comes in, like the 40-yard district down by the train station, and 1 and 3 Boston Way, it gets permitted the same way. Planning board looks at the multifamily plans, they look at the design, they make sure it's sort of reasonably compliant with the design standards, and the project gets approved. And then that advances to construction. Here, it could be comparable to that under zoning, but it could also be another streamlined permit process called with the 40B process, where I mentioned earlier, where a comprehensive permit, a singular filing, goes to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and they look at that, the overall permitting process, put aside the zoning in part, and conceptually sort of putting aside the zoning for a second, and determining whether or not that project is reasonable based on what's being presented in a consolidated and streamlined review process. And that's something that we're contemplating right now as an alternative to the traditional zoning process. We're not sure which path that will take. That's still open, so I can't comment much further on that, but that is where we are discussing more specifically within that larger area right at the moment. This is just a rendering of a sort of conceptual rendering of what that redevelopment might look like. This is sort of a rendering from Low Street looking up the driveway. So you get a kind of an idea of what that redevelopment might look like at that location. Something here, depending on the details, of course, which always remain to be seen, this could be something that helps to revitalize the area. If we keep the commercial, it could become part of mixed use. There's always the debate about scale and size and architectural design and whatnot. But this is the sort of concept that was presented to us. And again, the zoning, which it doesn't translate directly into this particular project or plan, and that's something we'd have to discuss as a community, city council, planning board, and others, is what do we think is appropriate for that area under zoning, and whatever path that takes. But this is what has been sort of presented to us as a possibility. Switching gears, this is the Brown School. So again, options that we have, this is not one that we've talked a lot about, MBTA communities and the accessory dwelling units, but this is the Brown School. So adaptive reuse of the Brown School, we've been talking about that for a couple of years. This is one property that the city owns. It's the largest one that we own that we could really create a notable number of affordable units on. So it becomes key for us if we're going to use public property as opposed to just doing zoning changes and then relying upon private developers to do it. So in this case, that's the yellow is just dotting the property involved. There is some parkland that has to be preserved. And of course, there's interest in the gym. So we're not sure how those things will shake out. But we have seen, and these responses, these proposals are on the city's website. We received 3 proposals relatively recently to redevelop the Brown School as affordable housing, or as affordable and mixed and market rate housing. And each of those proposals, I'm not reviewing them all here, but they are on the website. And these are just some of the snapshots, sort of concepts of what that could be there. This particular one replaces the gym with an addition at the back and reconfigures the site. alternative one, again, I'm not going to explain this in great detail, but these are basically options for redevelopment of that property. And the question is sort of, how many units might we get out of that at the end of the day? And as was Suzanne and Madeline mentioned earlier, there are different levels of affordability. So is it the standard of sort of 80% area median income? We're reaching that threshold, or are we trying to get to deeper affordability and those who might be in greater need? So is it 30% AMI? Is it 60% AMI threshold that we're working with? So at any rate, the range of units is somewhere between 30 and say 50 units that are being proposed between these three concepts, and we'll be having further discussions, to decide which of these we might be able to work with going forward. And that will ultimately be up to the mayor and the city council, of course, both with respect to zoning or disposition of the property, actual sale or lease of the property, but also the rezoning that might have to happen because the Brown School Overlay District has a cap right now of 18 to 20 units. There might be some other parameters, but the 18 to 20 units is lower than all three of the proposals that we've gotten, and even other concepts or indications we've received from folks in recent years that they can't make a viable project with affordable units at that small of a scale. So it's one thing we might consider is whether or not that unit capacity will be allowed to come up in the Brown School overlay. Two lots that we've talked about the Brown School, that's the primary parcel we have or property we have. We happen to have two vacant lots in the West End that could be suitable for a single family home. They're basically consistent with the surrounding neighborhoods as being comparable lots, but they don't have anything on them for various reasons. We sort of acquired or obtained these properties over time. So these are also possibilities if the city wants to surplus those lots, make them available for affordable housing, keep that restriction on them or whatever. Those could become additional affordable units in the community, again, using city land to subsidize or help to create those affordable units needed in the community. Those are the two lots. The one that I'm referring to here actually is the yellow on the bottom. The green one is sort of open space there in the back. So this one's off of Laurel Road. The one I previously showed is off of Turkey Hill. And then we have some examples of affordable housing. If it's all right, I'd like to pass it over to Tracy from our Newburyport Housing Authority, who could speak a little bit to, we have a couple of visuals here just to show, and maybe you can flip after that to mine. If you wouldn't mind speaking to the units and the needs. And,
oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, hi, I'm Tracy Watson. I'm the Executive Director for the Newburyport Housing Authority. And I think basically I'm here tonight to kind of give more information so that folks understand what the environment is here in Newburyport regarding state and federal affordable housing for some of our most vulnerable residents. Most of you are probably familiar with the Sullivan Building, which is located downtown on Temple, but right off State. That is a state housing. It's an elderly disabled building. We have 100 units there. I think some of the important things that as I talk about these buildings, these numbers tend to change a little, so I have my cheat sheet, but just so everyone knows, there's currently 37,621 people on the Newburyport Housing Authority wait lists.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, say it again.
I will.
Sorry, Tracy, you might
You both? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, in total, there are currently 37,621 people on the Newburyport Housing Authority's combined wait lists.
That's probably the most incredible number we've heard tonight.
I know, which is why I think it's very important for me to have touched on those. So in the Sullivan Building, we have 100 elderly disabled state units for folks who are looking to, who are in need of elderly and or handicapped housing. When you break those numbers down, there are 6,530 people on the elderly disabled wait lists for the Newburyport Housing Authority. We currently have 100 units here at the Sullivan Building, and then we have our federal property, Horton Terrace, over on Atkinson and Simmons, right there, and that property has 50 units. So you're looking at, and a handicapped, our disabled wait list is at 3,253. So in combination, elderly disabled, 6,530 on the wait list with 150 to offer in the city.
And Tracy, am I correct? It's difficult for you to get funds for any kind of expansion of units?
Oh, yeah, there will be no expansion of state. Our main goal in regards to the units that we currently have in the city is to maintain them forever. So we are very grateful to community preservation because we have done a number of projects with them on the facilities themselves in partnership with our, what we call formula funding, and then funds given up to us from from community preservation, such as Kelleher Gardens, which is our family property. It's a state family property here in Newburyport. We've been able to do roofs, all the siding, a few kitchens. We've redone the exterior of the community building, and the interior is currently out to bid. And of the family units we have here in Newburyport, we have 42 of them. And we have 13,494 people on our wait list. And we have 42 units. So that also brings us to, I think one of the bigger things is that, we do have vouchers. We have the affordable, it's called the HVP, that's for non-elder disabled folks, so that they can go and find housing. There's 24,819 people on that wait list. We have 33 vouchers that have been funded through the state, 33. And none of our current clients live in Newburyport. They can't. There's not availability for them. And many are folks who are raised or work here or what have you. And then we do have a federal Section 8 program. We have about 7,500 people on that wait list. We have 106 vouchers. 90 are currently what we call, they're leased up. The reason we don't have 106 leased up is because we don't have the funding, and that changes every federal year. So, but we have 90 that are out and leased, and probably a third of them are still here in Newburyport, but the rest have moved to other, communities within the state. Last year, we also absorbed the Rockport Housing Authority's federal Section 8. So that gave us another 136 vouchers. Not one is in the city. But that's also because we're absorbing a new program from a different city. So, with attrition, we'll see how that goes. But, so I feel like I'm the doom and gloom lady. I feel bad about that. But I thought it was really important. While Newburyport is one of the more diverse portfolios, because we have state, we have federal, we have the HVP program, we have the federal Section 8 program, and we also have 3 group homes here in Newburyport. And we also manage West Newbury. So we also manage the West Newbury Housing Authority as well. So it's a pretty diverse portfolio, but the numbers are the numbers, and while we're certainly not a Worcester or a Lawrence or any of the big ones. It is diverse, but it's small. It's real small. And I can't tell you, and we speak about it a lot here with the senior center. We were just here a couple weeks ago too, and the folks here tell us one of the main things that they hear from folks is housing authority. What can I do? I had a gentleman that's lived in town his whole life, called me the other day and said, well, I'm 62, so can I apply? Average waits are anywhere from 5 to 10 years. So I encourage folks to apply, whether you're still in your home or you're not in your home, or you're planning to sell and not planning to sell for a few years. So it's one of the things that we're really starting to try and educate folks a little bit more, that don't wait, don't call me on Tuesday when you turn 62 and hey, can I move in? Because it's not going to happen. So because of the waits. So I feel a little doom and gloomy, but on the outside, we also, under our umbrella, have the Newburyport Affordable Housing Corporation, and that's a nonprofit. They have developed 2 different properties on Titcomb and Woodland. Those provide 8 project-based Section 8s for folks. There's 3 units there and 5 units over at Woodland. And those are, right in the neighborhoods. And the thing is that the affordability stays with them. So when a resident, and the thing for the residents there is once they're there, because it's project-based, once they're there for a year, they can then take their voucher and move elsewhere if need be or what have you. So you're providing housing to that person, then you're providing housing to the next person that comes in as well. So as I said, it's a very diverse portfolio, but we more and more housing production is needed. But
do you know, has that number, it's astonishing number you started with, has that significantly gone up? Do you know, are you able to say in the last 5-10 years, like what kind of trajectory is that? A steep?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say that we've seen a steep incline in the last 5 years. Yeah, a steep incline.
Thank you, Tracy. Obviously a significant, it's difficult to expand, necessarily that resource, significant for those in the community, those units. So, by the way, I just flipped to the Tickham, one of the Woodland Street units that Tracy referred to, but I also wanted to show just a couple of examples that have, again, I think primarily because affordable units can fit anywhere. Example of, where an affordable unit can fit in. This is actually the 166 Route 1 project that has been permitted, the other third 40-yard district project. This would happen at the so-called Haley site. There's actually a plan to have sort of maintain some sort of active use there, possibly, similar shop. At any rate, that will be next to the bike path, more housing there. And this is just sort of conceptual rendering of that. In terms of unit capacity or what's been built out, again, 1 and 3 Boston Way, you can see the unit numbers, 76, 19 affordable, and that's in 1 Boston Way, and then 84 units at 3 Boston Way, with 21 of them being affordable. I also wanted to note the Foundry is obviously a notable one for the city. I wasn't involved this years ago, but in terms of city initiative. So this is 20 units, 13 affordable. Part of the, we actually only have 11 today that are out there, but that's partly because of some of the mechanics of how you can essentially lose. If there's not a eligible tenant, there's a possibility of having those come off. So, but at any rate, we have some units there. And then the James Steam Mill, obviously wanted to note that as well. A pretty significant one. So with that, the YWCA Hillside, obviously 10 units, all being affordable, the single room occupancy, great kind of energy efficient community, and this is built into the hill there as part of that as well. This is an example, again, another one where you're just sort of residential neighborhood. This is Oleo Woods, the OSRD, or open space residential development that happened years ago. And there are 2 affordable condos in there as well, and that's just a rendering of those. And so those are, traditional suburban sort of, neighborhood, but they blend in there as well as that. So the next steps, just to kind of put a highlight and a pin on some things that we do need to do in the coming weeks and months. This is because it's an important fall for us in terms of housing and actually taking actions to facilitate and advance that, address that need. One is the review and approval of the housing production plan. So we're just starting that process, and we want to work together with the City Council and the Planning Board and the Housing Trust to finalize that plan and get it approved and send it off to the state and have them review and approve as well. We do have, as I think I mentioned earlier, on the counter there's a couple of handouts that show, and it's on the website as well. I just put an excerpt of the strategies, the core strategies that are recommended in the plan, is sort of a 2-page front and back. So if you want to read those, we did speak to some of those earlier. So the plan itself is a strategy and a plan of action as best we can estimate for the next 5 years. And then we have to adopt the accessory dwelling unit zoning amendment to comply with the state. So that has been mobilized, and we're looking at that in committee as well. And then we have the, again, I would say formality of, but the zoning amendment required for updating and complying with MBTA communities, and then that's our 40-yard district expansion. And then we have other things that are, we're still sort of discussing the details of, not exactly sure per se where those will land. They might be involve some further discussion than, say, the ones that I just mentioned. But consider appropriate rezoning and redevelopment for a couple of things like the Kmart site or the larger Story Avenue and Low Street area, some sort of village center, and of course the Brown School. So those are other ones that are sort of potential near-term zoning and redevelopment discussions that would play into creating more housing and affordable housing. So I guess what we'd like to do now is kind of open it up to if there's any, if we're recognizing we're sort of at 8:30, and I realize that we're not necessarily going too much later for folks, see if there's any questions or comments from the audience. We'd like to hear what your needs and thoughts are. So
Yeah, any questions? Again, we didn't get it within an hour or 90 minutes, but we're happy to sit here, and the whole panel is open to answer questions, so we're going to just come around. I know this little magnifier, that would be great, and then I'll have them, Andy, if you have them see whoever's going to answer questions.
yeah, if you're responding to any questions, feel free to come up here just so we can, we'll try to.
Yeah.
It does not project for the room, but it, yeah, it's.
I feel like the answers should have the mic, and then we're going to just.
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah.
I currently live near the Low Avenue, Story Avenue area you're proposing, and I have concerns about traffic assessments and roadways. How does that figure into the planning and zoning for these areas?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's pretty typical when we talk about larger scale developments to have, traffic studies. So definitely something to consider. I think we need to recognize that Story Avenue is basically, sorry, apologies. Story Avenue is essentially Mass DOT jurisdiction, Mass Highway jurisdiction. I'm reluctant to think there'll be significant changes there just based on what we have today and what's been, in more recent time adjusted there. But traffic study, I would expect to happen, whether it's a zoning or a 40B process, I'd expect that to be analyzed. The specific improvements that might need to be done, I can't speculate as to what those would be right now, but I know that we'd be certainly efforting to make sure that sidewalks, bike lanes, bike paths, and so forth are included. But things like the number of vehicles, queuing, how things are, meeting at a signalized intersection or a roundabout, or things, those are other things that we'd have to look at as a consequence of that. But it's a very good point that we would want to look at the traffic, the trips that would be generated, we call it trip generation, that would be coming out of those new units. And we basically overlay that out on top of the existing traffic patterns and analysis, and basically see how much is that going to contribute to traffic congestion on a given street or a street segment, and then what we back in from that, what changes could be done within reason to manage that better, to help it flow better, to minimize the delays and things that would happen. But right now, we have not got into that level of review yet, either under the zoning or friendly 40B process. So I can't speculate what those improvements might be just yet. Sure, thank you.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Regarding the Boston Way places, I know somebody who lives in them, and they say that they're frequently empty. There's a lot of turnover over there. And based on our housing wait list, I was just curious if there's a way of the city approaching them to try to increase the amount of affordable units if many of them are empty.
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak to that because the last time I had conversations with Minko, my understanding was they're pretty occupied, but I appreciate you pointing that out because I'd like to follow up. So I'm not aware of that necessarily being an issue, but incidentally, the developer who did that project had actually come in, I don't know, within the last 6 months or certainly last year, to have a conversation with me because the recognizing the MBTA communities component, you might have recalled me mentioning earlier, where the state under MBTA communities was sort of reducing or adjusting the threshold you could go to for the affordability percentage to 10 to 20%, but not allowing you to go to 25%. Essentially coming back and saying, we did 25%, and to your question, could we go higher than that, which I'd love, and I'd certainly support and would say it's financially feasible, but asking them to go higher, the question there was, hey, everybody else now is going to be getting this 10 to 20%, could it possibly be reduced? So, I completely agree with what you're suggesting, which is, having a discussion about going with a higher percentage. The natural inclination, which I was not necessarily surprised to see, because when I saw the legislation, I immediately sort of realized developers are going to be looking for the lower ratio, that we'd get a question, well, we got this permitted at 25%, but is it reasonable to kind of have that reduced now and change it? And I think we as a city decided we did not want to reduce that threshold from 25%. I'd certainly be advocate for going higher, but that is, we didn't want to go any lower similar, but we certainly haven't seen any indication. Most of the discussions that I've had, and I think this is pretty universal regardless of which development team, is you basically, and I'm not saying I agree with this argument, the financial argument, the pro forma analysis, but the argument is always, well, we can't make the numbers work. We can't quite, and I know that sometimes comes to, well, we can't get it financed, or we can't make the numbers work to make it actually constructed. I happen to believe that a lot of that goes to profit margin, and the question really being, what is a reasonable profit margin for folks to get when creating these housing units? I'm not persuaded that it's not possible to have higher than 25%, for instance, or have lower prices for the rentals, as we were talking about earlier. Are those actually affordable? I am not persuaded that those are the case. But we certainly would want to increase those things, and I'd certainly love to effort that. But I have seen pretty much universally that the 25% tends to be sort of like the capacity there for developers generally. We more often than not will see like a nonprofit, the YW for instance here. Those entities, nonprofits more so, tend to look for like, is it 30% AMI? Is it 60% AMI? Are all the units in the building affordable? We don't often see developers doing a higher percentage per se. But a great question, and I definitely think that's the direction we should be going in. Sorry, and I'm sorry, just before I go to the back, you had raised your hand. I didn't want to. Yeah, sorry.
First off, I applaud the efforts to have affordable housing for people there in Newburyport. My first concern is, if you build all these things, what is going to prevent non-Newburyport residents from getting into those houses? Like, what if the governor decides that she's got 2,000 people in Logan Airport and we have space for them here? What prevents that? Because that goes against what you're planning on doing. My second concern is water and sewerage. Water is an exhaustible resource. And truly, my friends in the water department, not the water department, but the water commission, a few years ago, they whined and cried that because we were in a drought, we needed to save water. So the city put forth great effort to save water. And then they said, oh, you save too much. We have to up the price of your water. There's no end to what happens to the poor taxpayer here in Newburyport. And the sewage treatment plant, when they built Woodman Way, there was a big controversy on whether the sewage treatment plant could handle the additional sewerage. And there's not a city or state project that I'm ever aware of that either came in on time or came in on budget, and all the overage is just passed back to the property owner. I don't want to be priced out of my house. Those are my comments.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody at the table wants to address that. I did want to address the first question. We have something called local preference that we can, to the best of our ability, incorporate into the permit process here, where these projects are happening and we're permitting something and we're having through that process, we're at 25% affordable, whatever. We can essentially say and work with the developer and the project to have preference given to local residents. However, they have to be qualified. They have to meet that threshold for eligibility for income. So if they're not eligible, it can go to others, right? To your original point. So there is ability to give preference to locals, but we can't always guarantee that with the outcome. If there isn't anybody eligible, it would go to the next folks in line, so to speak. I don't know if anybody else wanted to add anything to that. The other thing I wanted to speak to was water and sewer, because obviously as a land use planner, I'm concerned about that as well. My understanding, although we haven't, we sort of started and we haven't quite finished, an analysis of the overall water and sewer capacity and how that relates to any future build-out, total build-out, for instance, we might have in the city, not just one area or consideration, but as a whole. To my understanding, based on sort of a broad brush, it's not that, at least in the near term, that either of the treatment plants would have issues. There certainly would be lift stations and distribution lines and things that have to be upgraded in between. And I know that, I think Woodman Way came before the treatment plant, the wastewater treatment plant was upgraded, for instance. So I don't think we have necessarily, at least immediately in the near term, issues at the plants. That doesn't dismiss all the other, and I appreciate all the other concerns about costs and whatnot. Those are all valid, 100%. It may not be that the plants have issues, but I definitely think it's something we constantly want to be cognizant of. I, as a land use planner, I recognize that whether it's the city or the state or the country or the world, there's a finite amount of horizontal land, there's a finite amount of water, right? So we can't grow indefinitely, right? And we can't, so we need to be realistic about that as well. We're not building another Quabbin reservoir, right? We already have a huge, water supply over the town line, and we provide for other communities. So we do need to be realistic about what can be built out at the end of the day. However, I don't believe, based on the discussions that we've had with public services and the water and sewer divisions thus far, that we would necessarily in the near term, say with the 40-yard district expansion or with the Story Avenue Low Street area per se, exceed those capacities. But I think they're 100% valid considerations, and we should stay hot on them. I think. So, I don't know if anybody else here wanted to add anything. Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Matt Keene. I guess there's certainly a lot to unpack in this meeting, so I actually just kind of wanted to make a general comment and finish with a question. But other communities that have kind of grown, that I've seen grown, I grew up down the South Shore in Hingham, and Hingham went through a growth period where the town grew up probably 20-25%. And that was done under, hey, we're going to get more revenue, we're going to get all this. But then what happens is they had to build 2 more schools, renovate a school, upgrade their water, traffic, all of that stuff. Taxes didn't go up. The taxes didn't go down. They went way up, right? So I guess I just wanted to encourage, and thanks, Sean, for hosting this. I know that you have a great love of the city. You grew up here, that's why I moved here to raise my family, right? It's a beautiful city with a lot of character. So I would just encourage the mayor and the city councilors are here to really, let's just slow our roll a little bit. There's a lot of ideas out here. I think we have to be really, really careful about where and why we're developing. And that's kind of my question is, oh my God, after listening to everybody in government here talk about what we need, why? Well, change is going to happen, we're going to grow. But a few months ago, we went through that election. All we heard a lot about is how delicate our water supply is, and that's on the verge of potentially not working anymore, right? Everybody was talking about that. Now we're talking about adding, all these houses. So change is going to happen. And it all can be good, but I just think we have to slow down a little bit.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Scott DeVivo, West End. I want you to circle back to the ADU conversation. Is this something voluntary, or will it become mandated? I mean, are we trying to turn single-family neighborhoods into multifamily neighborhoods? I'm concerned about that.
That's a great question. And the only way I can sort of briefly speak to that, I guess, is the best way really is, so the zoning administrator and I, we work together. We spend a lot of time with our staff planner and others, with our boards and the city council, talking about land use patterns and how things will affect things. Something to keep in mind with respect to the ADU zoning amendment, or even going back to the statute, and I mentioned this earlier, but all the dimensional controls and things are still applicable. So one thing there's definitely a question for every given lot, what could happen there, and we have to walk through the particulars for that given lot. There's a million different sizes and shapes of lots and structures and things in the city. But there's a fair amount of smaller, what we call non-conforming lots or non-conforming structures in the city, in the denser historic areas of the city particularly. So that being the case, those things will essentially indirectly be necessarily limiting on the numbers that can happen in those areas, because the dimensional constraints are still applicable, and so they're gonna limit the ability of some of those to happen in some of those instances. So it's not quite as sweeping as saying, well, they can happen everywhere. There's still a fair amount of restriction based on the spatial relationships that would preclude some of these from happening per se, but it's hard to sort of estimate citywide because there are so many different size lots and configurations that doing a full build-out analysis would be difficult. So I think it's a valid consideration, and we can't obviously sort of the legislature has made a decision, so we need to comply with that. But at the end of the day, I don't know if it's going to be quite as wide sweeping, as we're character changing, so to speak. But again, that's one thing that why zoning changes over time, and I don't know whether the legislature, or the statutes would change. That's another thing. But we would certainly be looking to modify our zoning if we were seeing issues arise. Even from where we are today, we adopt zoning, but it's constantly changing because we need to update it to address issues. So if we're running into something, as long as we're not violating the statute, we might reconsider the parameters to address that if that's something that we're seeing as a concern. So valid concern, definitely expected it to come with the accessory dwelling units, for instance, different than say multifamily districts are all consolidated in one space. But the dimensional spatial relationships that we have, in particularly in the denser historic areas of the city, will be limiting.
Can you just clarify, it's a state law and when it goes into effect?
Yes, sorry, this goes into effect in February, so we must adopt a zoning update to our zoning, otherwise we'll be out of compliance with the statute. So at any rate, we do need to take action before then. There are some certain parameters, and it's too much to unpack here, but there are certain parameters that we can modify or tweak, but there are some things we cannot, and some of those we touched on briefly. But it's a valid consideration, but we do need to take action as a community. Just like with MBTA communities, we don't want to be out of compliance with the state, we don't want to be sued, we don't want to lose state grant funds, we don't want to have litigation over our zoning being out of compliance. That would be, it would be inappropriate for me to recommend that path. So I do think we need to update them. And I do think, in fairness to the neighborhood character and size and scale and massing considerations we have, we understand that the dimensional requirements are one of the things that help us to make sure that it doesn't become ballooning out of control in a given neighborhood, right? So here, for instance, there's a limit of 1 ADU on a lot. You can't have any more than one, right? So things like that, we will take those into account. I think it's a valid consideration, and I definitely suspect, I can't speak for councilors, but I suspect that they're fully cognizant that that's a consideration here. Yeah, thank you. Newbury.
My question is about capping property taxes for people on fixed incomes to allow them to continue living in their homes.
I don't know if I would be able to address that, unfortunately.
I guess all I'll say is that we are continually looking for levers like that we can utilize here. I think we're utilizing most of them right now, but that's certainly something that the city council can take up. That would have to be a process that we go through with that.
The city has periodical over the years, and then there is one currently before the council for consideration that deals with affordable units. But looking for methods by which we can essentially help along those lines. So I think that those tax relief programs are considered by the city. I can't presuppose at the end of the day what the council and the mayor and others will sort of agree to. But some of that is also dictated by state statute. So if there is a provision, we can obviously consider whether or not to include that exemption or allowance, if you will.
Thank you. Hi, I have two questions, one on the ADU and one on the Kmart. On the ADU, and maybe you can't answer this, was there a lot size restriction as far as how large your lot is that you'd be allowed to put one on?
For the accessory dwelling unit?
Yep.
The statute doesn't speak to that really, and that's why I mentioned I think it's really important for all of us to understand that the sheer local, already applicable or to be revised, dimensional requirements and then spatial relationships that are codified will still be applicable. But the state didn't say your lot, is got to be this size in order to have an ADU per se.
In the Kmart question, I might have missed it because I heard you shout out some unit capacity numbers at like the Brown School. For the Kmart, was there an estimate on the number of units?
Yeah, sorry, for that particular, this is not the whole district or the larger study that we might do to see whether or not we have any kind of larger changes there over time. Again, any rezoning there would take decades to build out anything there. That's just how things happen, for construction purposes, but permitting and construction. But as far as that particular project, we're somewhere between about 200 and 212 maybe units, somewhere in that range is for that specific piece that I was referring to earlier right now. That's what's being contemplated, at least for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think the current dialogue anyway is relative to that being 25% rental, 25% affordable and all rentals, which is sort of comparable to what we've had in the 40-yard district, just to be clear.
I don't think there's anyone on the Zoom.
Is this actually working?
Port Media.
Thank you guys for all this information. I'm always looking for ways that we can continue to expand how much housing we build, and so I appreciate this conversation. In particular, I'm wondering if we have looked at
Could we expand sort of the density on the housing authority properties that we own, maybe through a public-private partnership? And have we also looked at the surface lots at the MBTA to see whether there's a way that we could build on those? Because those are, I mean, surface lots are, you know, that's just low density development. We could certainly build up higher there. So just wondering if we've been thinking about that and other sites throughout the city.
Yeah, great question. So when I first got here, really was the time when the 1 and 3 Boston, well, 3 Boston Way was a separate piece at that time, but the 1 Boston Way was owned by the MBTA, and that was being surplus, and there was a dialogue going on with developers, and we were in the process of adopting our 40R, and so that all kind of fit together. There was actually interest in from some teams, developer teams, in looking at the other remaining lot that's down at the end of Boston Way and having something there. It could be a deck of parking, you know, kind of consolidate footprints or whatnot. Again, without taking away the transit component or the parking that might be important for others, trying to add that. So there is interest in that or consideration. I think the more recent one that's been discussed, though, is this possibility, at least, of providing more housing. And again, we don't know what will happen. This would be probably a while before anything would happen if it were to. But the C&J or the park and ride lot, that's a possibility in a similar vein. It's a possibility because it's such a huge lot. You could keep a transportation component and have housing there in a way. Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that the governor said, you know, right out of the gates coming into office was, if you have land in your municipality that the Commonwealth owns, that housing could work on, you know, contact us, coordinate with us, and so great point.
They're actively doing that, they're taking inventory of all their properties. I think the park and ride is a good possibility, but one of the sticking points there is federal funds were used a number of years back to expand it there, so that there's a couple hoops that they're have to jump through. So they're in the process of trying to see if there's a path forward. So maybe just develop a little of that stock for single affordable housing and keep the rest of it for transportation. Jane,
On those figures that you gave of the 13,000 on the waiting list, is there, I'm assuming that those are not all Newburyport residents.
Correct.
Do you know the percentage that are Newburyporters that are waiting?
No, because we'd have to go through all 13,000 of them. So, yeah, no, we don't.
Well, you had mentioned that they got a preference, so that's why I thought they might have been
Well, not until, well, what happens is when you have a vacancy comes up, we do what's called a pull. And so we pull a wait list, X amount, and then the priorities and the preferences come into play.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
We got a question here.
Thank you. My name's John, and my wife and I live down the courtyard side of State Street. So it sounds like you're about to surround my house with apartment blocks. It's not a question, it's just a comment.
I'm sorry, just clarifying again, we're approximately just geographically.
Close to the courthouse.
Courthouse, okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I just wanted to say that. My question is, do we get to vote on any of this?
The zoning questions don't typically come to like the residents per se. I mean, those things could.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just want to hear you say it.
Yeah, they're typically done by city council, right? And just FYI, and I know I was showing a little bit of the map, and this will be online tomorrow. We'll post the slides, but the 40-yard district is already sort of wrapping that area. There is a discussion, as I mentioned earlier, about expanding further west on Parker Street and going or further east on Parker Street to grab the Heinz Way development, if you will. But that district allowing or that overlay is already there essentially for some of that area, so it may not be necessarily a change. That's already sort of pre-existing zoning, if you will. But again, appreciate the concern.
Right,
sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do we vote for you guys?
No, it's the city council.
Just you? Okay. Okay, all right. Just want to make sure. All right. And then, so my only other quick question, as a follow-up to the gentleman in the front, one of his concerns was, I want to ask, so at no point, is it true that at no point will Newburyport be compelled by anyone in Boston or anywhere else to take anyone into these units? Is that correct?
You answer that. You can't answer that.
Correct? They said we can't answer.
So, when compelled, are you talking about the emergency shelter system?
I'm talking about someone saying they're people that are going to come live here.
This is all market rate stuff.
I can answer that, 'cause this rumor's been going around. Can I answer? This rumor's been going around for months. So there are places where there was publicly owned property that the state has worked with to use, like an old prison that was closed down. So that stuff has happened. The developments we're talking about here tonight are all private. So no, the state can't come in and take something over like that. Oh, they have been doing that with hotels, but.
No, I have a question.
Oh, sure. Oh, you have a question, like after this? Okay. So yeah, so I know, I get a lot of emails about this. I don't know where that came from, but no, that's not in the cards right here. All right, Jim, you want to go back here first? Okay.
I just have a question, especially with the MVPC here. So on page 6, the first bullet point, when you look at the demographics, the projection is we're going to lose 5,000 people, 3,000 people.
3,000.
And we're going to lose 600 or so in the next 5 years. So the question then becomes, we're trying to add 400 units for 3,000 less people. I'm asking if in putting the numbers together, you can help me square that circle, that we're going to have 15,000 people in a community that currently has 18,000, and we need 10% more housing.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And again, what we're trying to address is the current situation. So regardless of what population projections suggest, we have an issue right now with affordability. And you're right, that those variables will change if the population were to substantially decline or increase. I get very reluctant to talk about projections that are that far out, because we see them constantly get revised. Each time the census takes place, each time the American Community Surveys takes place, who they connect with in the community impacts those projections. So try and frame this more around affordability right now, availability of housing units right now that match what the community needs. A good graphic or a good data point to recognize is in the community of Newburyport, roughly 66% of the housing stock is 3 and 4 bedroom homes, but actually when you look at households, only 40% of the households are that size. The actual predominant households now are 1 and 2 person households. So we have another issue, which is that there are folks who are living in homes probably because this is what they can afford. They're not going to want to move out because to get something new is going to cost them money, but that's also a housing mass that could potentially go to a family that wants to move into that location, while you free up some units potentially for other folks who are starter homes or maybe looking to downsize. So I really appreciate the comment about population projections, but we have to look at what's happening right now and the availability right now.
Sorry. Just one other comment, I guess, in response. In terms of population projections, it's actually a conversation that we had with Ian, one of the folks who works with George on the plan with us. Sort of hesitancy to think of this sort of plummeting, if you will, of population, thinking about, new zoning districts, expansions, things that might happen in these multifamily areas. I wasn't necessarily seeing, that would be necessarily an accurate projection of population down the road. So I was a little hesitant to think, yes, there are certain algorithms and things that, this is pretty common, right? We try to project as best we can, but I don't know that algorithm or that projection is going to be accurate for us if those other changes are happening. So.
And just one other comment, the projections are made annually based on the American Community Survey data, and then every 10 years from the census. And even since last year, they've actually dampened that decline in population that was initially projected. So we just revised those numbers to show a more shallow decline in population. So it's a good variable to keep in mind, but it is not the only variable.
Yeah, thank you. And Afroz Khan, I'm a city councilor at large here, and I do also want to make a point, though, too. And when we look at housing, availability of housing, what's the stock of housing, aside from just looking at the parameter of the total number of residents and what's the trend of people living here, the other thing that's really important to understand is available housing for people working here. And that includes the teachers, that includes our law enforcement. You'd be surprised how many of the people that serve our community cannot afford to live here. And that's something that really does resonate if we were to look at that in total number. And that kind of makes me sad when my daughter's, teachers are like coming and commuting from different communities.
So why are we not sure if there's enough eligible people to fill the affordable housing in our community?
What do you mean? Can you say that?
So there's these long wait lists of people who are waiting for affordable housing in this community, but we're not sure if we have enough eligible people to take those spots, and therefore
It's two
people
different
from
things.
outside the community can come in where you have so many people in need here.
It's two different things.
Oh, sorry, yeah, it's probably too much to unpack here, the whole sort of, income eligibility, how much assets you can have and so forth. I don't know if everybody wants to sort of speak to that. It's a valid question. One of the things that we have sometimes run into, or I think it comes up frequently, I feel like, is...
It's two different populations you're talking about, and it's two different
Yeah.
situations that you're speaking to. You're speaking to, an affordable condo, and your most vulnerable. It's actually two completely different populations. You have someone that is working, teachers, firefighters, what have you. So they're in a situation where they're looking to buy an affordable condominium set. My folks, those are not the folks we serve. We serve the most vulnerable, the lowest income and the most vulnerable.
We talked about earlier about AMI, right? So I think 80% is probably what we're talking about in some workforce. I mean, even that's high for some of our workforce. But some of the things that we're talking about for state-run and federal-run affordable housing, now you're talking like 30%. 40%,
and under, right.
6%.
So it's no, you're taking, it's just two different populations.
Yeah.
Okay, but it sounded like we have plenty of both of those populations in our population. And we're struggling to support the people who live in our population, the elderly, veterans, the service industry that was just talked about, teachers, nurses. So if we have long lists of people in need, why is there a question mark as to whether or not the housing that you're proposing we build will go to anyone other than the people in this community? Is there an answer? Why is everyone here in the headlights after I ask this question?
Well, I'm not sticking around. Sorry.
I don't know.
And I also don't understand why we don't get an answer when we ask what amount of tax we're going to be charged for all of this. We're not getting educated on why communities who rejected these rezonings rejected them. Where is there an objective, unbiased third party to educate us on why communities have fought against this? And why are we not getting the answers to real questions? All we get told is, I appreciate the question. I would appreciate the answers.
As far as precluding folks from living in the units, I mean, I don't know of any statute or case law that sort of allow us to basically say we can only have Newburyport residents going into these units. There's definitely the ability to have local preference when some of those affordable units are happening, but the ability to basically say you can't, others in the outside community can't come and buy the units or live in the units here. That I don't know that would be viable, even in terms of the courts looking at something like that. Just want to make that comment.
Yeah, no, I just want to, caution you here. This is one night of 2 hours worth of information. This is not a simple process. It is not a simple topic. It is very complicated. And even those of us who have been doing this for our whole careers are still trying to figure this out. Things change, laws change, there's new legislation, there are zoning changes. There's layers and layers and layers of approvals that have to happen. And we get gummed up in the process and nothing happens. Because a lot of people in this room maybe don't want anything to happen. But I want to ask a show of hands, how many people were born here? Okay, not a lot. We all came here from somewhere else, and I'm proud to be a Newburyporter for the last 22 years. We should be a welcoming and open community, not worried about who's going to take over our housing. We don't have the same conversations we don't have the same conversations when we're talking about luxury units. It's like there's different traffic for the luxury units, there's different water needs for the luxury units. No, it's not the same. Please be respectful of the process and the people in this room who are doing their best jobs to make this happen.
Let's stick to one narrative.
Please.
All right, I think something that around that though, like taxes, assessments are going up, right? So people are paying more, right, each and every year. Not necessarily. If you increase the housing stock, you can make. That depends on what housing you're putting in. We're not building like huge developments so families are coming in here. We're trying to find rentals units so people can come in. So, what's that? Yes, but a lot of those improvements are going to be part of any kind of development that comes in. Yes, that's how it works.
I was just wondering if there's already a provision in place, and maybe if there isn't, it's something that the city would consider for people who have these big homes that are, 3-4 bedrooms, and maybe they're down to 1 to 2 people. If they chose to want to split off their house to be able to rent that unit, is there a provision for the city to be able to help them afford that if they're having a hard time affording where they're living in their house by themselves?
So I'll leave the trust. There are certain programs or certain ways that, say, the housing trust or other programs can help to, make mechanically or financially help that to happen. From a zoning perspective, there are ways, and we started to touch on a little bit with the accessory dwelling unit. Accessory dwelling units are not necessarily going to be a freestanding structure. They could be an addition. They could be built into an existing structure by breaking down the space in between. And actually, I think it was spoken to earlier, but that's one of the things that we've seen over time is, in terms of the loss of rental units, is like a larger structure that had multiple units being converted into a much larger, singular unit. So if what you're referring to is sort of, having some options that will be happening that way, we have the ability to do that. Some of it does go back to the zoning parameters, but at the end of the day, there is the ability to, create another unit or break that down into smaller units if that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, in most cases, what I see, and I don't know if this is always the case, where somebody has to sell their house and then a new developer comes in and then splits it off. But is there a provision for people who are already in their home who don't want to have to leave their home, maybe quartered it off so they can still live in a portion of it, and then they rent out, they sell the other part?
Yeah, well, and in effect, that's in part what the ADU or is allowing, and the state is sort of trying to encourage. It's not, it's not just like it could be a freestanding structure. It's a lot of cases it could be reconfiguration and breaking down of a situation like that where someone, an elderly person who has a fixed income, is trying to get a little more revenue, could pay for the mortgage, right, and then the rent, the real estate taxes. This is an example, I think, exactly what you're getting at, which is there is the ability to do exactly that, help the person to stay there and help others, and it's a lot of people in the community. We have businesses downtown who've said to us, we can't keep our employees close enough, right? So I think there's definitely a way to do that, and I think it's definitely one of the ways that we can.
If there's a provision already, does the city help to afford the changes and the upgrades to the home so that the person on the fixed income doesn't have to somehow find that money to do that themselves to then rent it out or something?
Yeah, the question of financial programs, I don't know that we have a current program with the Housing Trust, but we can certainly have it. I think it's a worthwhile question. We should have some dialogue about what we could do along those lines. We have talked about, for instance, the idea of sort of buying down like from the market rate to the affordable unit and then having that be, affordable, long term, right? We sort of cover the gap or the differential. But I think we'd have to have some further conversation with the Housing Trust and others about whether or not we could do exactly what you're referring to here. That type of assistance program, I don't think we've had as of yet.
But I do want to say, as a city councilor, I like your idea. And folks know the Community Preservation Act, so everyone's, pays property taxes. A portion goes towards what we're mandated to do is to actually give the Affordable Housing Trust a portion of that, a significant portion. These are programs we, even as councilors, we could ask for. So I really like your idea. I like that creative thinking. So thank you.
Anyone else for questions? Yep.
I just have a Waterfront West update. I haven't heard anything about that. With Cart and the boys.
Sure, I can do that. Yeah. So yeah, that wasn't part of tonight. Yeah, we missed it. So, and I guess for people who don't know, so when I first took office, one of the first things I wanted to do is kind of come at Waterfront West completely different than the last administration. So we put together an advisory group. We eventually got up to 5 city councils on there, city employees, planning board. And we try to do a term sheet of like kind of learning from everything that happened in the past and what do we think could happen down there, right? And I think what's great about that area now is that they actually own the complete site. So there was that one little building in front of Michael's, Richard's Alignment, that they didn't own the last time they went through this. So now they have that piece of the property, so they have more flexibility in what they're proposing. So once we worked on our term sheet, then it became a back and forth between NED and us. So the point where we're at right now, we're pretty much at the point of the term sheet where we're just going back and forth. So what we've decided to do is move forward with, out of that term sheet, you want a development agreement to come out of that, and then you want the zoning. So we brought in an attorney who's been working with us on the development agreement, and then we also brought in someone, Emily Innes out of Newbury, who is working on the zoning piece. And so hopefully sometime this fall, this will be that other thing that the city council will take up.
It's not going to be a 40B.
So that fits into all of this because right now it could be a 40B. So that's still on the table for NED. That's why something like Kmart, if we can do a friendly 40B possibly and get that into safe harbor status, we take that off the table there, right? That's where we're at. That's where we're thinking for that.
But it has to be done. This decision has to be done this year. Is there a time restriction to make that?
Well, I mean, for us, I mean, it's how do we get to safe harbor status as quickly as possible, right? I mean.
But as far as NED.
Oh, NED? No, they're not. They're happy to sit on it for now. They're not. To be honest, I've really enjoyed working with them throughout my first 2.5 years. They really want to work with the city and get something done, so that's where I'm coming from with NED. So.
Affordable housing with a waterfront view.
So there would have to be an affordable component to that. So right, you're talking, but you're not talking the higher numbers, right? Yeah.
It's going to be 600 square feet.
Yeah, that's not an affordable housing project. But they could, if they got fed up with the city, they could say, hey, look, we're going to come in and we're going to bypass your zoning, and we're going to.
The city gets to represent that.
What?
That's rich.
So many units, they were talking 300 units down there initially?
Initially, I mean, their number's been all over the place, yeah.
Yeah, that's more.
But the problem is, if it's a 40B, then we lose control. Again, they don't want to do that. That's not the type of development they want to do, but that is something that's on the table for them.
So these zoning changes or zoning relief,
Well, no, this is for.
Oh, okay, sorry. These zoning changes, zoning relief, are they, I see that they're generally geared towards the affordable side, but are they also geared towards just increasing density? In other words, are you possibly looking at, changing lot size requirements for a two-family where maybe a single family sat? And then the second part would be, is there any relief from historical aspects of, if there was an old house that you have to wait a year to tear down and then maybe put up 2 or 3 units, something like that?
So we have some regulations already in recent years that have been adopted that help to preserve the historic structures, if you will, in this sort of that context. The ability of folks to basically have the multifamily housing, the MBTA communities is really the way that the additional housing, I think that's kind of hitting like the initial part of your question is, the state is basically streamlining, and then local communities under MBTA communities are streamlining multifamily housing in those specific locations, if you will. But we did talk several years back, we had talked about what we call sort of right-sizing the dimensional requirements in zoning, and the idea behind that as well. If the lot sizes are much larger requirements today under zoning for new permits than the actual neighborhood has, it doesn't represent the neighborhood at all. Should we consider revising the zoning to kind of represent it? I think that was kind of tabled a bit. There wasn't as much interest, at least at that time, sort of advancing that consideration. So I'm not seeing in the near term, at least as of right now, not necessarily substantial changes or adjustments to those kind of parameters. It seems to be that the primary focus, and certainly what's coming out of the state legislature and the statute and statutory requirements, is the concentrated multifamily in these specific locations and then under the MBTA communities. And the accessory dwelling units, subject to all those spatial limitations that are in our zoning, the accessory dwelling units specifically. So those are kind of the two that are in play right now. Other than the Story Avenue area that I mentioned, we might sort of consider that as a longer term sort of village redevelopment of areas that are already developed. And of course the Waterfront West area, other, sort of infill potentially there, and the Parker Street section of the 40-hour district. We haven't really had discussions of like larger scale changes or, permitting and so forth elsewhere. I think the question of whether somebody could demolish a structure and try to put something larger there, that goes back to the same dimension requirements, goes back to the same questions of can they get through the permit process for demolition of a historic structure. Those things would still be applicable, I think, if that helps to answer your question.
Any other questions?
Sorry, he's got a hit. That's where, yeah.
Just referring back to the Kmart situation. In that situation, and maybe in some other private, all these are private properties, you're saying, that they're not city-owned, that, are up for development potentially. Has there been any consideration or talks from the city, or what would it take for the city to maybe propose that the city buys that property from them so that we can do as we want as the city instead of have it be up for market value plus, a little bit, so that we could take down our wait lists?
It's a great question. The question of utilizing the debate that would be had about using eminent domain powers, taking property, right? And you could always buy it. You could work to a purchase price. Understandably, a developer who's got a substantial water view and could get a substantial number of units may not be as interested in selling it, or may have a debate with us about how much it would cost, right? If it was just a straight transaction. You could talk about taking a property by eminent domain and saying, we think we could do something better or more appropriate with it or more affordable with it. Those are always options as well. But those are also more difficult discussions because again, that's up to the executive and legislative body to decide, not staff or necessarily the folks that are here at the table. But at the end of the day, there's an upper sort of level of consideration before making that sort of decision. I think it's a 100% valid question. In the case of Waterfront West, the question came up even like a couple of years ago, sort of, is there, would there be interest in the city basically saying, look, we think we might have a better idea what could happen there. Does it make sense to, take the land by eminent domain and then redevelop it according to zoning standards that we think make sense? Those are options that could happen potentially anywhere at any given time if there's a legitimate public purpose for taking property, or in the case of just a private, typical private transaction, purchasing it at whatever the appraised value is and then doing something with it. But we're also somewhat impeded by, say, like the market values of the land, right? I happen to think that the appraisal process helps to sort of leapfrogs over the appraisals before it, and everything just sort of leapfrogs above that, right, in terms of valuations. But it's a valid consideration. The city would have, even though we own, say the Brown School, we do have in the state, there is the ability to take property or to purchase property and then do something with that. But that does require, at least initially, even if you're getting repaid on the tail end somehow, there is that initial financial commitment, or decision, and that can also be difficult to do that. So it is possible, but it would require an additional level of consideration to basically upfront the money, if you will, even if you're making it up on the tail end.
And would the city be able to weigh in on those types of decisions as members of the community?
Oh, you mean the residents or constituents?
No.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent, like everything else, I guess, these processes are a little bit different, unfortunately, the government structures and regulations and so forth are sort of layered. But in the same manner as everything else, if you're giving feedback to your ward counselor, your counselors at large, the mayor, obviously we as staff, we pay attention as best we can, try to take into account the community's interests and needs. If you're letting us know, or if something's coming in timely, being looked at by the boards and committees or the city council, if you're giving feedback, we try to take that into account as best we can. Whether or not something's actually being presented to you like a town meeting and you're taking a vote directly on it, it's a little bit different here, right, in the city, so we don't often have things go to like a ballot question. A lot of those things are typically decided by the mayor and the city council through ordinances, or orders, things like that.
But it wouldn't be important to ask the residents, like, their thoughts on things like that?
Oh, well, and I'm sorry, just to be clear, even though you may not be taking a direct vote, part of the reason that we have, this is just a more broad brush public meeting, about the broader subject matter, but the specific meeting, for instance, we're having here next Wednesday on the specific zoning amendment, that there's a reason why we have these, and it's statutorily required, but that's the reason, even just as a policy, why we have those public meetings, so we can get that input, and recognizing that's, we try to get, folks to show up and to chime in, whether or not they come to the meeting or give us feedback in other ways, but we try to get that feedback, and that is one of the ways by which, before a zoning change happens, there's not only feedback from the planning board thinking long-term about giving advice to the city council what would make sense from land use, but also the constituents, of the entire community being able to come out and say, here's what what we think about this zoning amendment or that zoning amendment. We try also, the entire time, to have a broader discussion. So when we do a whole plan for housing or a whole master plan, every 10 years, we try to have that broader community discussion so that it can inform those decisions, even as a more general matter, aside from any specific action like accessory dwelling units or MBTA communities or something that's, Kmart that's timely being acted on. We try to get that broader input periodically as well through those processes.
Can you say more about next week? I haven't heard about any other meetings.
Sorry, next Wednesday here just happens to be, next Wednesday, the advertised, it's the joint public hearing. It's our typical process where the city council and the planning board get together, look at a zoning amendment that's been proposed or, drafted for consideration and decide from there, essentially what to do with it, right? There's planning board's job under the statute is to provide a recommendation or any feedback or thoughts or concerns they have to the city council for their council's consideration. Council ultimately controls all that decision, but the planning board provides an advisory opinion. Our office and others may also offer, input as to what we think makes sense or what might be improved upon. But it's up to the council at the end of the day as to what to do with it. But in this case, the zoning change that's being proposed is specifically for that Kmart portion of the area that we were talking about earlier. It's specifically to contemplate how that might be permitted under zoning and what would be appropriate there. And that remains to be seen, in discussions.
Is that also at 7 o'clock?
It's also at 7 o'clock. Yeah, it would be in this space here.
That's public?
Here. Yeah, oh yeah, that's public. Yeah.
There's a question.
And I'm sorry. Yes.
This isn't a large question, and it's not going to do a lot for getting new housing here, but we know of several situations where there was a multifamily house. It was purchased by someone as a single family. Someone else has now bought it, and they want to turn it into multifamily again. And according to what we know, Newburyport does not allow that.
Yeah, so it's a little hard to parse out that because typically what's going to happen is, and this is more reflective of what would happen if you want to come to our office tomorrow, have to follow up, we can have a call, or I'll talk with you after. Every property is a little bit different, the situation, so I want to make sure I'm getting the information correctly and then building off of that what's possible and what can and cannot happen. But generally speaking, if someone's gone back to something that's like lower in density or more conforming, and then they want to sort of expand it or make it more dense or whatever, there's probably a sort of a barrier there or a permit process that would have to happen for them to go that route generally based on what you've just told me. But I could follow up with you and sort of figure out from there if there's more particulars and kind of make sure I'm giving you a completely accurate answer as to what the options or potentials are.
But it's not a black and white that you can never go back.
It's not that it could never go back. There's certainly some constraints, and it depends on the district, depends on what the allowances are, depends on what the dimensional requirements are, depends on whether someone's applying for a special permit for nonconformities, to modify something that's already nonconforming in some way, or to get a variance, which is a total exception from the rule to have X, Y, or Z. But so I'd have to talk about some of those particulars, but at the end of the day, it may be more difficult to do it, but it's not that it's necessarily impossible to do it, but there are reasons why we have zoning, and that's to make sure the character of a neighborhood, for instance, is within a certain consistency, if you will, overall. And in some cases, if you've got something that's there that's compliant, or you've had something that was non-conforming and you brought it into compliance, you'd have difficulty then, or more uphill work to do, at least for permitting, to have it go back to something that's, say, more dense or, less conforming, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of hard to unpack all that, just a quick response.
This is a house that's on an absolutely main street. Everything is dual. There's not, I don't think there's more than 4 individual houses. So I just was wondering why this happens at some places and not others.
Yeah, again, without looking at the specific property in context, I'd have to, because unfortunately there are so many different properties and configurations and situations in Newburyport that I want to make sure we're looking at the specific one in context there. So I'm happy to talk with you after if you want to follow up to make sure I'm giving you as much as I can on that particular situation.
Any other questions? Oh, Jim wants to ask. So Jim, you're good? Well, thanks for being here tonight, everybody. I know this is a lot of information. Please keep asking your questions. You don't have to do it in public here. Come talk to Andy. Come talk to your city councilors who are all here. I mean, I think what's important, the housing piece, Brown School really is the only thing right now that we have some control over. And whatever the fate of the Brown School is going to be determined by the city council. The zoning piece, again, we're not building all this housing that we're talking about tonight, but the zoning piece is what's going to control whatever kind of housing comes into the city. And again, that falls into a public process with your city councils, right? So those are important things. I just don't want to have that get lost in the discussion. I want to thank all of our speakers. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all the information. And we'll keep doing these. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you.